Imagine, if you will, living in a world where the fastest way to send a message was to give it to someone on a horse. A world where news of a battle, a death, a birth, or a business deal could take days, weeks, or even months to reach its destination. A world where kings might rule over territories so vast they could die before learning of events on their borders. A world where lovers separated by 100 miles might wait weeks between letters, where merchants gambled fortunes on information that might be obsolete before it arrived, where generals fought battles unaware that peace had already been declared. This was the world our ancestors inhabited for all of human history until a remarkable moment in the 1840s, a world where distance and time were inseparable, where communication moved only as fast as a human, a horse, or a ship could carry it. It was a world unimaginably different from our own, where a message sent from London to India might take 6 months to arrive, and another 6 months to receive a reply, a full year for a simple conversation. To understand the magnitude of the telegraph's impact, to grasp why contemporaries called it the annihilation of time and space and the highway of thought, we must first journey backward to a time before wires, before electricity, before instant communication. We must understand the world as it was when information traveled at the speed of wind and muscle, when patience was not a virtue but a necessity, and when the great barrier to human connection was not will but distance. This is the story of how humanity communicated before the telegraph, a story of ingenious solutions to an ancient problem, of systems that seem primitive now but were marvels in their time, and of a world that was about to change forever. For most of human history, the speed of communication was limited by the speed of human movement. A message could travel only as fast as a person could walk, run, ride, or sail. This fundamental constraint shaped civilizations, limited the size of empires, and defined the boundaries of human connection. The earliest forms of long-distance communication were visual and auditory signals that could be seen or heard across distances: smoke signals, drums, horns, and beacon fires. These methods were brilliant in their simplicity, but severely limited in the information they could convey. Indigenous peoples across the Americas used smoke signals for millennia, creating different patterns of smoke puffs to convey simple messages across vast distances. A column of smoke rising from a mountaintop could be seen for miles, alerting distant communities to danger, announcing arrivals, or calling people to gather. But the information was limited, perhaps a dozen different messages at most, and weather could make the system unreliable. The ancient Greeks developed a more sophisticated system of fire beacons. Towers were built on hilltops across the landscape, each within sight of the next. When Troy fell to the Greeks after 10 years of siege, the news traveled over 300 miles to Mycenae in a single night through a chain of beacon fires, each watchman lighting his fire upon seeing the previous one, creating a relay of flame that carried the message, "Troy has fallen," faster than any runner could travel. The playwright Aeschylus immortalized this in his tragedy Agamemnon, where Clytemnestra describes the beacon chain, fire sending fire onwards, beacon to beacon. It was an impressive achievement, news in hours that would have taken a messenger on horseback, yet the message was simple, a single yes or no signal, nothing more.
In Africa, elaborate drum languages developed that could convey surprisingly complex messages across the dense forests where visual signals were impossible. The talking drums of West Africa could transmit messages over distances of up to 100 miles through relays of drummers. The drums mimicked the tonal patterns of spoken language, allowing drummers to encode actual sentences into rhythmic patterns. A skilled drummer could send messages like, "The chief's wife has given birth to a son," or "Traders from the east are approaching." But this required both sender and receiver to be fluent in the drum language, and the system was limited to regions where this knowledge existed. The drums spoke, but only to those who had learned their language. All these systems shared fundamental limitations. They required line of sight or earshot, meaning they needed relay stations. They could convey only simple, pre-arranged messages. They were vulnerable to weather, darkness, and misinterpretation. And most critically, they could not transmit complex information, nuanced instructions, or new ideas. For anything more detailed than a simple alert or announcement, humanity needed messengers, actual people who would physically carry messages from sender to receiver. The messenger, a person who carries a message from one place to another, is one of humanity's oldest professions and one of the most crucial to the development of civilization. Without messengers, large-scale organized societies would have been impossible.
The Persian Empire, which stretched from the Mediterranean to India, developed perhaps the ancient world's most sophisticated communication system around 500 BCE. King Darius I established the Royal Road, a 1,677-mile route from Sardis in modern Turkey to Susa in modern Iran, dotted with relay stations approximately every 15 miles. The Greek historian Herodotus marveled at the Persian messenger system. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds, a phrase later adapted as the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service. These royal couriers could cover the entire royal road in 7 days, changing horses at each station, riding continuously day and night. For comparison, a normal traveler would need 3 months to cover the same distance. The system required maintaining hundreds of horses, dozens of stations, and scores of riders in constant rotation, an enormous expense justified only by an empire's need to govern distant territories. Yet even this impressive system had severe limitations. 7 days was fast for the ancient world, but it was still 7 days, a week during which circumstances could change, during which enemies could advance, during which opportunities could be lost. And the system served only the empire's official business. Ordinary people had no access to such swift communication. The Roman Empire built on and refined the Persian model, creating the cursus publicus, a state-run courier and transportation service that connected Rome to the furthest reaches of the empire. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads, many of which still exist today, and established relay stations, mansions, every 25 to 30 miles. Imperial messengers could travel up to 50 miles per day on horseback, occasionally more in emergencies. When the emperor needed to communicate with governors in Britain, Syria, or Egypt, messages would be entrusted to these riders, who traveled with official passes that allowed them to commandeer fresh horses and demand assistance from local authorities. Julius Caesar communicated with Rome from Gaul, modern France, through regular dispatches carried by riders. His famous report, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered, took days to reach Rome, arriving long after the battle it described. Generals fought campaigns with delayed instructions, responding to situations that might have changed by the time new orders arrived from Rome. When urgent news needed to travel even faster, multiple riders might be used in relay. In 9 CE, when Roman legions were destroyed in the Teutoburg forest in Germania, the news reached Emperor Augustus in Rome within a week, an impressive feat requiring non-stop riding and multiple changes of horse and rider. But even this emergency speed meant Augustus learned of the disaster days after it occurred, too late to send reinforcements or modify strategy.
When the Roman Empire fell, so did much of its communication infrastructure. Medieval Europe saw a dramatic slowing of communication. The roads deteriorated, the organized courier systems collapsed. Messages traveled primarily with merchants, pilgrims, or occasional travelers willing to carry letters. A message from London to Rome might take 4 to 6 weeks in summer, longer in winter when snow blocked alpine passes. From England to Jerusalem during the Crusades, messages could take 3 to 4 months each way, meaning a question and answer might take up to a year. This slowness shaped medieval life profoundly. Kings who left for the Crusades might be gone for years with only occasional messages reaching home. Merchants who sent goods to distant markets might not know for months whether their ships had arrived or been lost at sea. The Pope in Rome could issue bulls and decrees that wouldn't reach Ireland or Scandinavia for weeks or months. The medieval world was a world of profound isolation, where most people never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace, and where news of events in the next kingdom might arrive months late, if at all.
The European age of exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries expanded human contact across the globe, but also revealed the staggering communication challenges of a world connected by sailing ships. When Christopher Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Europe didn't learn of it until he returned in March 1493, 5 months after his initial landing. The news had to physically travel back across the Atlantic in Columbus's ships, moving at the speed of wind and current. As European powers established colonies in the Americas, they faced a fundamental problem: how to govern territories thousands of miles away when every instruction, every question, every report had to travel by ship across an ocean that might take 6 weeks to 3 months to cross, depending on weather and currents. The Spanish Empire, which stretched from Madrid to Mexico City to Manila, faced communication delays that bordered on absurd. A message from Spain to the Philippines would travel across the Atlantic, overland across Mexico, then across the Pacific, a journey that could take a year or more. A bureaucrat in Manila asking for instructions from Madrid might wait 2 years for a reply, a year for the question to arrive, a year for the answer to return. These delays made colonial governance a strange exercise in delayed decision-making. Colonial governors had to act on their own authority because waiting for instructions was often impossible. Wars could begin and end, economies could boom and collapse, cities could be founded or destroyed, all before word reached the mother country. In 1815, the Battle of New Orleans was fought 2 weeks after the War of 1812 had officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent. The treaty had been signed in Belgium on December 24, 1814, but the news didn't reach America until February 1815. In the intervening weeks, over 2,000 men were killed or wounded fighting a battle that was strategically meaningless, dying because information traveled only as fast as a ship could sail. Merchants in London, Amsterdam, or Boston lived in a state of perpetual uncertainty about their overseas ventures. A merchant who sent a ship to India with goods to trade would wait 6 months to a year to learn whether the ship had arrived safely, whether the cargo had sold at profit, or whether the ship had been lost in a storm or to pirates. Merchants gathered in coffee houses. Lloyd's Coffee House in London became famous for this, to share news from incoming ships, to learn which vessels had arrived in distant ports, which captains had died, which markets were glutted or desperate for goods. Ship arrival was an event, a moment of revelation that could mean fortune or ruin. Insurance premiums reflected this uncertainty. A ship that hadn't been heard from in months might be presumed lost, insurance paid, only for the ship to arrive weeks later, delayed by storms or repairs. Information traveled with the physical thing. You learned your ship arrived when the ship itself arrived.
As commerce expanded and literacy spread, the need for reliable message delivery grew. Postal systems emerged to serve this need, but they remained fundamentally limited by the speed of transportation. The Thurn and Toxis family established one of the first organized postal services in Europe in the early 16th century, carrying mail across the Holy Roman Empire. By the 17th century, most European nations had established state postal systems, often with monopolies on letter carrying. These systems worked through networks of post offices connected by postal roads. Riders or coaches would carry mail from town to town on regular schedules. A letter mailed in London might reach Edinburgh in 4 days, Paris in 5 or 6 days, requiring a channel crossing, Rome in 3 weeks. The speed depended on distance and geography. Mountains, rivers, and seas were barriers that slowed communication. A letter from England to the American colonies might take 2 to 3 months to arrive, 6 to 8 weeks for the ocean crossing, plus time for internal delivery at both ends. In 1840, Britain introduced the penny post, a revolutionary system where anyone could send a letter anywhere in Britain for 1 penny, prepaid with an adhesive stamp, the world's first postage stamp, the penny black. Before this, postage was expensive and usually paid by the recipient, who might refuse the letter to avoid the cost. The penny post made written communication accessible to ordinary people for the first time. Letter volume in Britain exploded from 76 million letters per year in 1839 to 350 million by 1850. But even with this democratization of mail, speed remained constrained by transportation. A letter from London to Manchester, just over 200 miles, took about a day by mail coach. To Scotland, 2 to 3 days. To Ireland, depending on the destination, 3 to 5 days, including the sea crossing. The United States, with its vast distances and expanding frontiers, faced even greater challenges. The U.S. Post Office, established in 1792, tried to connect the sprawling nation with post roads and mail routes, but the distances were daunting. In the 1840s, a letter from New York to San Francisco had to travel by ship around Cape Horn, a 15,000-mile journey that could take 4 to 6 months. Or it could travel overland by coach and mule train, still requiring weeks. The mail route from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico, about 800 miles, took 6 weeks by wagon train. During the California gold rush of 1849, miners desperate for news from home would pay exorbitant prices for letters, sometimes $2 or $3 for a letter that cost pennies to send, the premium reflecting the scarcity and value of information from the distant East. For businesses, this slow communication meant operating in a fog of uncertainty. A merchant in Boston ordering goods from New York might wait a week for a reply to a simple query. Ordering from London meant waiting 2 to 3 months for confirmation. Contract negotiations could take months, a proposal sent, weeks of waiting, a response, more weeks, a counteroffer, and so on. A business deal that today might be concluded in an hour of emails or a phone call could take half a year of correspondence. Imagine being a merchant in 1840 trying to coordinate with suppliers, customers, and agents across the country. You send a letter asking about the price of cotton in New Orleans. 2 weeks later, your letter arrives, your correspondent writes a reply, 2 weeks more, and you receive the answer. But the price has changed in the intervening month, and your letter might prompt a decision based on outdated information.
In the 1790s, an ingenious solution emerged that, for the first time in history, allowed messages to travel faster than a horse could gallop. The optical telegraph or semaphore system represented humanity's first attempt to separate information from physical transportation. Claude Chappe, a French engineer, invented the optical telegraph in the early 1790s. His system used towers built on hilltops, each equipped with a movable wooden beam with 2 smaller beams at each end. By positioning these beams at different angles, the system could represent different letters, numbers, and common phrases. Each tower was positioned within telescopic sight of the next, typically 5 to 20 miles apart depending on terrain. An operator at each tower would watch the previous tower through a telescope, read the position of its beams, and replicate that position on his own tower for the next station to see. Messages traveled as a wave of moving mechanical arms rippling across the landscape, visual information moving at nearly the speed of sight. The first line, completed in 1794, ran from Paris to Lille, a distance of about 140 miles with 15 stations. A message could travel the entire distance in approximately 9 minutes, compared to 32 hours for a horse messenger. The impact was immediate and dramatic. For the first time, the French government in Paris could learn of events on the battlefield in near real time and send orders that arrived while the tactical situation was still relevant. During the wars of the French Revolution, this advantage was significant. Napoleon Bonaparte recognized the military value of optical telegraphy and expanded the network dramatically. By 1844, France had over 5,000 kilometers of optical telegraph lines connecting Paris to over 29 cities, with 556 stations employing 3,000 operators.
A message from Paris to Toulon on the Mediterranean coast, a distance of 475 miles that would take a horse messenger 3 to 4 days, could be sent via optical telegraph in about 20 minutes during good weather. The semaphore system was revolutionary, but severely limited. Weather-dependent, fog, rain, snow, or even bright sun in the wrong position could make signals impossible to read. The system operated only during daylight and only in clear weather. Some estimates suggest the system was operational only about 3 hours per day on average. Limited capacity. Only one message could be sent at a time in each direction. The entire line would be occupied transmitting a single message. Slow for complex messages. While simple coded messages could be fast, transmitting detailed instructions or reports took much longer. Operators had to encode and decode using codebooks. Expensive infrastructure. The system required hundreds of towers, thousands of operators working in shifts, constant maintenance, and could serve only routes where towers had been built. Government monopoly. The French semaphore was reserved exclusively for government use. Ordinary citizens and businesses could not access it. Communication remained slow for everyone except the state. Despite limitations, other nations adopted optical telegraphy. Britain built a chain of semaphore stations from London to Portsmouth and to other naval ports. Sweden, Spain, and other European countries established networks. The U.S. Congress commissioned a line from New York to Philadelphia in the 1840s, but it was never heavily used and was abandoned after a few years. The semaphore represented an important conceptual breakthrough. For the first time, information could be transmitted without someone physically carrying it. The message existed as a pattern of mechanical positions that could be replicated across distance without the message itself moving. But it remained a primitive technology, a stepping stone to something greater.
To truly understand the pre-telegraph world, consider these stories that illustrate how slow communication shaped history. The War of 1812 between the United States and Britain officially ended with the Treaty of Ghent, signed on December 24, 1814. But news of the peace treaty took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. During that time, January 8, 1815, the Battle of New Orleans was fought, killing over 2,000 men. January-February, naval battles continued in the Atlantic. February 11, 1815, news of peace finally reached New York. Men died in battles that had no purpose, fighting a war that had already ended because information traveled at the speed of a sailing ship. In 1815, the Battle of Waterloo determined the fate of Europe. Napoleon's defeat or victory would dramatically affect European financial markets. Nathan Rothschild, the London banker, established a relay of messengers and used carrier pigeons to learn the battle's outcome a full day before official news reached London. With this one-day information advantage, Rothschild was able to buy British government bonds at depressed prices before news of Wellington's victory arrived and prices soared. This early information coup, made possible by private investment in fast communication, reportedly helped establish the Rothschild fortune. The story illustrates a fundamental truth of the pre-telegraph era. Information was wealth, and faster information was greater wealth. When President William Henry Harrison died in office on April 4, 1841, it took days for the news to spread across the nation. April 4th, death in Washington, D.C. April 6th, news reached New York by express mail. April 8th, news reached Boston. April 11th, news reached Cincinnati. April 20th, news reached St. Louis. May, news reached California. For weeks, Americans in distant regions conducted business, made decisions, and lived their lives unaware that they had a new president. The nation was governed differently in different regions, not by policy, but by the speed at which information traveled. In the personal realm, slow communication shaped relationships in profound ways.
A young man moving west for opportunity might exchange letters with a sweetheart back east. If he wrote proposing marriage, she would receive the letter weeks later, consider her answer, write a reply, and send it back. More weeks of travel. By the time he received her answer, 2 months might have passed. A conversation that today might occur in minutes once spanned seasons. Long-distance courtships required extraordinary patience and faith. Lovers separated by a few hundred miles faced communication delays that tested their commitment in ways difficult to imagine today. By the 1830s, just before the telegraph invention, the speed of information across various distances had reached certain practical limits. Within a city, immediate, via messenger on foot or horseback. Reality, even in a single city, getting a message across town and receiving a reply might take hours. Regional, 100 to 300 miles, 1 to 3 days by express rider, 2 to 5 days by mail coach. Example, New York to Philadelphia, 95 miles, about 1 day. National, 500 to 1,000 miles, 5 to 10 days by the fastest means. Example, New York to Charleston, 700 miles, 7 to 8 days. Continental United States, coast to coast, 4 to 6 months by ship around Cape Horn, 3 to 4 months overland after 1850s when routes were established. Even express service took weeks. Transatlantic, Europe to America, 3 to 6 weeks by sailing ship, weather-dependent. After steamships, 2 to 3 weeks by the 1840s. Europe to India, 3 to 6 months by ship around Africa. After the 1830s with overland routes, 6 to 10 weeks. Around the world, 1 to 2 years minimum for a message and reply. These times represented the absolute ceiling of communication speed using the best available technology and paying premium prices for express service. Ordinary mail was often slower. The slow speed of information in the pre-telegraph era had profound consequences across all aspects of life. Economic costs. Markets operated with imperfect, delayed information. A merchant might ship goods to a market that was already glutted, arriving to find prices collapsed, or fail to ship to a market with shortages and high prices, missing opportunities. Arbitrage, buying goods where they're cheap and selling where they're expensive, was risky because by the time you learned of a price difference and acted on it, the opportunity might have vanished. Financial panics spread slowly but inexorably, like a plague moving at the speed of mail coaches. The Panic of 1837 in the United States spread from city to city over weeks, with each region learning of bank failures and responding in turn. Military costs. Generals fought with outdated information. A commander receiving orders from his government had to assume the situation might have changed by the time the orders arrived. Initiative and independence were essential because waiting for instructions could mean defeat. Wars were sometimes fought unnecessarily, as with the War of 1812's final battles, or prolonged because peace negotiations couldn't be conducted in real time. Political costs. Governing distant territories was an exercise in trust and delay. Colonial governors made decisions that might be countermanded months later, but by then consequences had already unfolded. Diplomacy moved at a glacial pace. Negotiations between distant nations involved months of waiting between each exchange. Complex treaty negotiations could take years. Personal costs. Families separated by distance lived with constant uncertainty. A father working in California during the gold rush might learn of a child's birth 6 months after the event, might receive news of a death months too late to return home. Emigrants to America from Europe often left families behind, knowing that letters would take months each way and that they might never see their loved ones again. The slowness of communication made distance more absolute, separation more final. Throughout history, people dreamed of faster communication. Scientists and inventors proposed various schemes, some practical, some fantastical. Ancient dreams. Greek legends told of Hermes, the messenger of the gods, who could travel with supernatural speed. The dream of instantaneous communication was ancient. early modern proposals. In the 17th century, various inventors proposed sympathetic telegraph systems based on the incorrect belief that magnetized needles would move in coordination at a distance. These didn't work, but showed the hunger for instant communication. Some proposed networks of men with telescopes and signal flags. Others imagined complex mechanical systems. All sought to overcome the fundamental barrier of distance. The missing piece. What was needed was a force that could travel faster than any physical messenger, a medium that could carry information at speeds transcending horses, ships, or even light signals. That force would be electricity, a phenomenon being studied in laboratories across Europe, not yet understood as a communication medium, but about to revolutionize the world.
By the 1830s, the world stood on the brink of a communication revolution, though few recognized it. Several trends were converging. Increased need. Railroads were expanding, creating a need for coordination and safety communication. Business was becoming more geographically dispersed. Newspapers were developing, but their news was often weeks old. Governments needed to coordinate across expanding territories. Scientific progress. Electricity was being studied systematically. The relationship between electricity and magnetism was being explored. Battery technology had improved, providing steady electrical current. Scientists were publishing experiments showing that electrical signals could travel through wires. Existing infrastructure. Optical telegraph networks showed the value of rapid communication. Railway lines were creating natural corridors for future telegraph lines. Postal systems had established communication networks that telegraph could piggyback on. Growing frustration. The limitations of slow communication were becoming increasingly intolerable. Business leaders, military commanders, and government officials all recognized the need for faster information. The optical telegraph had shown what was possible, but had also revealed its limitations. The stage was set. The need was evident. The scientific knowledge was emerging. What remained was for someone to bring it all together, to create a practical system that could send messages through wires using electrical signals, a system that would work reliably over long distances, a system that could be deployed widely and used by ordinary people. That system was about to arrive, and it would change the world as dramatically as any invention in human history. We have traveled together through thousands of years of human communication, from ancient beacon fires to Roman messengers, from sailing ships carrying letters across oceans to optical semaphore towers dotting European hilltops. We have seen a world where information moved only as fast as horses could gallop or ships could sail, where a message from New York to San Francisco took months, where news of a European event reached America weeks after it occurred. It was a world of patience by necessity, of isolation by distance, of uncertainty by delay. It was the only world humanity had ever known, a world where time and distance were inseparable, where being far away meant being cut off, and where communication was measured in days, weeks, and months. But even as the 1830s unfolded with their mail coaches and sailing ships in laboratories and workshops across Europe and America, scientists and inventors were experimenting with a mysterious force that had fascinated humanity since ancient Greeks first rubbed amber and created static electricity. They were discovering that electrical current could flow through wires across distances. They were learning that this current could be controlled, modulated, and made to carry information. They were, though they didn't yet fully realize it, on the verge of the greatest communication revolution in human history since the invention of writing itself. In our next chapter, we will meet the brilliant and sometimes eccentric inventors who wrestled with electricity, trying to harness it for communication. We will witness the moment when Samuel Morse sent the first message over a long-distance telegraph line with the words, "What hath God wrought?"
we will see the birth of a technology that would, within just a few decades, wire together the entire world and collapse the barriers of distance that had constrained humanity since the beginning of time. The revolution is coming, carried on copper wires and powered by batteries, expressed in dots and dashes that would become the language of a new age. The world is about to shrink, and communication is about to become, for the first time in history, nearly instantaneous across vast distances. Rest now, and when you're ready, we'll explore how sparks and signals became the telegraph, how persistent inventors overcame skepticism and technical challenges, and how the first messages traveling faster than any horse would herald a transformation in human society so profound that we are still living with its consequences today. The slow world is ending. The age of instant communication is about to begin.
In the last chapter, we journeyed through millennia of slow communication, experiencing a world where messages traveled at the speed of horses and ships, where news from across an ocean took months to arrive, where distance and time were inseparable companions. We stood on the edge of the 1840s in a world that had communicated the same way for all of human history, a world about to be transformed by a force that humans were only beginning to understand: electricity. Imagine now a different kind of journey, not across vast distances of geography, but into the intimate spaces of laboratories and workshops, where a handful of curious, obsessed, and sometimes eccentric individuals were experimenting with a mysterious phenomenon. These were men who had noticed that certain materials, when rubbed together, could attract small objects, who had discovered that this strange force could be stored in glass jars and discharged in sparks, who had learned that it could flow through metal wires like water through pipes, though far faster and more mysteriously. They were natural philosophers, inventors, artists, and tinkerers, working in different countries, often unaware of each other's progress, all pursuing the same tantalizing question: could this electrical force somehow be harnessed to send messages across distances? Could the lightning that Benjamin Franklin had famously captured with a kite be tamed and made to carry human thought across miles in an instant? This is the story of how electricity became communication, of the brilliant minds who made it happen, of the false starts and bitter rivalries, and of the moment when dots and dashes first traveled through a wire, carrying a message that would change the world forever. The story of the telegraph begins not with a single inventor having a sudden flash of inspiration, but with decades of gradual scientific discovery, with multiple inventors working simultaneously in different countries, and with the slow accumulation of knowledge about a force that seemed almost magical in its properties. To understand how the telegraph emerged, we must first understand the state of electrical knowledge in the early 19th century and the brilliant experiments that made electrical telegraphy possible. Electricity had fascinated humans for millennia. The ancient Greeks knew that rubbing amber, electron in Greek, with cloth would cause it to attract small objects like feathers or hair. The phenomenon was curious but seemed to have no practical application. For over 2,000 years, electricity remained a parlor trick, a minor curiosity demonstrated by natural philosophers to amuse audiences, but understood by no one. The first major breakthrough came in 1800, when Italian scientist Alessandro Volta invented the voltaic pile, the first battery capable of producing a steady electrical current. Previous electrical experiments had relied on static electricity generated by friction and stored briefly in Leyden jars. These could produce dramatic sparks, but couldn't sustain a current. Volta's pile, constructed of alternating discs of zinc and copper separated by cloth soaked in salt water, could produce continuous electrical current for hours. For the first time, experimenters had a reliable source of electricity to study. The invention of the battery opened new avenues of research. Scientists across Europe began experimenting with electrical current, discovering its properties and effects.
In 1820, Danish physicist Hans Christian Ørsted made a discovery that would prove crucial to telegraphy. He noticed that when electrical current flowed through a wire, it caused a nearby compass needle to deflect. This demonstrated that electricity and magnetism were related, that an electrical current created a magnetic field. This principle, called electromagnetism, would become the foundation of the telegraph. Within months of Ørsted's discovery, French scientist André-Marie Ampère had begun developing the mathematical framework for understanding electromagnetism. He showed that the magnetic effect was proportional to the current and could be amplified by coiling the wire. British scientist William Sturgeon built on this work by creating the first practical electromagnet in 1824, an iron bar wrapped with wire that became magnetic when current flowed through the wire and lost its magnetism when the current stopped. Here was a way to turn electrical current into mechanical motion, to make electricity do something visible and controllable.
These scientific discoveries were published in journals and discussed at scientific societies, but few people recognized their potential for communication. The idea that these laboratory curiosities could be transformed into a practical communication system seemed far-fetched. Electricity was mysterious, unreliable, and poorly understood. The thought of using it to send messages when perfectly good messengers on horses existed seemed unnecessary, even absurd. Yet, a few visionaries saw possibilities. In the 1830s, in several countries simultaneously, inventors began working on electrical telegraphs. This parallel development would later lead to bitter disputes about who deserved credit for the invention, but it also demonstrates that the telegraph was an idea whose time had come. The scientific foundations had been laid, the need was evident, and multiple talented individuals recognized the opportunity. In Germany, Carl Friedrich Gauss and Wilhelm Weber, two mathematicians and physicists working at the University of Göttingen, built an experimental telegraph system in 1833. They strung a wire over a mile long between the observatory and the physics laboratory, using a galvanometer, a device that detected electrical current by the deflection of a magnetic needle, to receive signals. By varying the current, they could make the needle swing left or right, encoding letters and words. The system worked, demonstrating that electrical signals could be sent through wires over useful distances. But Gauss and Weber were scientists interested in research, not commercialization, and their telegraph remained a laboratory curiosity. In Britain, several inventors were working on telegraph systems. Charles Wheatstone and William Fothergill Cooke partnered to develop a telegraph that used multiple wires and multiple needles to point to letters on a diamond-shaped board. Their system was ingenious but complex, requiring 5 wires initially, later reduced to 2, and elaborate receiving equipment. Nevertheless, they succeeded in convincing railway companies of the telegraph's value for coordinating train movements and preventing accidents. In 1838, they installed a telegraph line along the Great Western Railway from Paddington to West Drayton, a distance of 13 miles. It was the first commercial telegraph in the world, and while it would ultimately be superseded by simpler systems, it proved that electrical telegraphy could work in the real world, not just in laboratories. Meanwhile, in the United States, a very different kind of man was about to revolutionize communication, though he came to the challenge from an unlikely direction. Samuel Finley Breese Morse was not a scientist or an electrician. He was an artist, a painter of considerable talent, who had studied in London and established himself as one of America's leading portrait painters. He had helped found the National Academy of Design in New York and seemed destined for a career in art, not invention. His path to the telegraph began with tragedy and chance. In February 1825, Morse was in Washington, D.C., painting a portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette when he received a letter from his father in New Haven, Connecticut. The letter, which had taken several days to arrive, informed him that his wife Lucretia was ill. Morse immediately left for home, but by the time he arrived, after several days of travel, Lucretia had not only died, but had already been buried.
He had not been able to see her one last time or even attend her funeral because information traveled so slowly that he learned of her illness only after she was gone. The tragedy affected him deeply, and while it didn't immediately lead him to the telegraph, it perhaps made him sensitive to the cost of slow communication in human terms. The actual inspiration for Morse's telegraph came 7 years later, in October 1832, when he was returning to America aboard the packet ship Sully. During dinner one evening, the conversation turned to electromagnetism, a topic of considerable scientific interest at the time. Dr. Charles Thomas Jackson, a Boston physician and chemist who was also a passenger, discussed recent experiments showing that electrical current traveled through even very long wires seemingly instantaneously. As far as anyone could measure, electricity traveled through a wire at essentially infinite speed, or at least so fast that the delay was imperceptible. Morse, listening to this conversation, had a sudden insight. If electricity could travel through any length of wire instantly, then it could carry messages instantly. A system could be devised where electrical pulses sent from one end of a wire would register at the other end, and these pulses could be arranged in patterns to represent letters and numbers. Communication could become instantaneous regardless of distance, limited only by how far one could string wires. The idea seized Morse's imagination completely. He spent the rest of the voyage sketching designs in his notebook, working out the basic concept of what would become his telegraph system. He envisioned a device that would make and break an electrical circuit in patterns, sending pulses through a wire to a receiving device that would record these pulses as marks on paper. These marks, long and short, dots and dashes, could represent letters and numbers. When Morse returned to New York, he was obsessed with the telegraph. Despite having no formal training in electrical science, no knowledge of the experiments others were conducting, and very limited funds, he devoted himself to building a working system. He set up a laboratory in his rooms at New York University, where he had obtained a teaching position, and began experimenting.
Morse's lack of scientific training was both a handicap and, paradoxically, an advantage. He didn't know what had already been tried and failed. He approached problems as an artist and practical inventor rather than as a theorist. When he needed technical knowledge, he sought help from colleagues, most importantly from Leonard Gale, a professor of chemistry at the university who understood electricity and helped Morse improve his primitive apparatus, and from Alfred Vail, a young man with mechanical skills and access to his family's ironworks, who would become crucial to perfecting the telegraph's design. The system Morse and his collaborators developed had several key components. First, a transmitting key, a simple switch that could be pressed down to complete an electrical circuit and released to break it. This became the famous telegraph key, a lever that an operator would tap to send signals. Second, an electromagnet at the receiving end that would be activated when current flowed and deactivated when it stopped. Third, a mechanism to record the signals, initially a pencil attached to the electromagnet that would make marks on a moving strip of paper, drawing a wavy line when the circuit was closed and a straight line when it was open. But the most important innovation was the code itself. Morse developed a system where combinations of short signals, dots, and long signals, dashes, represented letters and numbers. The code was designed with brilliant efficiency. The most common letters in English, like E and T, were assigned the simplest signals, a single dot for E, a single dash for T. Less common letters received more complex combinations. This code, refined with input from Vail and others, became known as Morse Code, and it would become the universal language of telegraphy for over a century. Creating a working telegraph in a laboratory was one thing. Convincing skeptical businessmen and politicians that it was worth investing in was quite another. Morse spent years trying to secure funding to build a long-distance telegraph line that would demonstrate the system's practicality. He traveled to Europe seeking patents and support, but found little interest. European telegraph development was already underway, and his claims seemed grandiose.
In America, Morse lobbied Congress for funding to build an experimental telegraph line from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland, a distance of about 40 miles. It was a modest beginning, but it would be enough to change the world. The construction of the Washington-Baltimore line began in March 1844 under Morse's supervision. The initial plan was to bury the wires in lead pipes underground, a laborious and expensive process. After several miles of pipe had been laid, tests showed that the insulation was inadequate and the signals were too weak. Morse abandoned the underground approach and instead mounted the wires above ground, stringing them from wooden crossbars, the first telegraph poles, predecessors of the telephone and power poles that would eventually line roads across the world. The work proceeded through the spring of 1844. By late May, the line was complete, running from the Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C., to the Mount Clair Railroad Depot in Baltimore, Maryland, a distance of about 40 miles. It was a modest beginning, but it would be enough to change the world.
The construction of the Washington-Baltimore line began in 1844 under Morse's supervision. The initial plan was to bury the wires in lead pipes underground, a laborious and expensive process. After several miles of pipe had been laid, tests showed that the insulation was inadequate and the signals were too weak. Morse abandoned the underground approach and instead mounted the wires on poles above ground, stringing them from wooden crossbars, the first telegraph poles, predecessors of the telephone and power poles that would eventually line roads across the world. The work proceeded through the spring of 1844. By late May, the line was complete, running from the Supreme Court chamber in the Capitol Building in Washington to the Mount Clair Railroad Depot in Baltimore. Everything was ready for a public demonstration that would prove the telegraph's worth. On May 24, 1844, a small group gathered in the Supreme Court chamber in Washington. Samuel Morse sat at the telegraph key, members of Congress, that messages could be sent instantly between cities. Morse had asked Annie Ellsworth, the young daughter of a friend who had brought him the news of Congress's funding approval, to choose the first message. She selected a verse from the Bible, Numbers 23:23. What hath God wrought? It was a perfect choice, simultaneously humble and grandiose, acknowledging both divine providence and human achievement, suitable for a moment that those present sensed was historic. Morse began tapping out the message, sending electrical pulses racing through the copper wire stretching to Baltimore. Dot dash dash dot, dash dash dash, dot dash dash, space, dash dash dash, dash dot, and so on. The biblical phrase translated into a new language of electricity and magnetism. In Baltimore, Vail received the message, the electromagnet pulling the pencil to make marks on the paper tape, and immediately sent it back to Washington to confirm receipt. What hath God wrought? The message was received, acknowledged, and returned in a matter of minutes. The transmission itself took only seconds. The first message sent faster than any horse could carry it, faster than any optical telegraph could relay it. For the first time in human history, complex written information had traveled from one city to another, essentially instantaneously. The demonstration was a success, but the full significance took time to emerge. The telegraph line between Washington and Baltimore operated for several months as a demonstration project, and initially there was surprisingly little public interest. People could send messages for free. This was a government experiment, but few people had urgent messages to send between these two cities. The line was quiet much of the time. The turning point came during the Whig Party's National Convention in Baltimore in early May 1844, just before the official demonstration. News of Henry Clay's nomination for president was telegraphed to Washington 45 minutes before the train carrying the news arrived. Political operators immediately recognized the telegraph's value. In an era when political intelligence could shape strategy, having information hours ahead of competitors was powerful.
Then, on May 1, during the demonstration period, the Telegraph reported news of a vote in the House of Representatives from Washington to Baltimore faster than the vote could have been carried by messenger. People in Baltimore knew what Congress had done before most people in Washington knew. The potential was becoming clear. Still, widespread adoption required private investment, and that required overcoming significant skepticism. The practical challenges were numerous. The science was still poorly understood. No one fully knew how far signals could travel through a wire, what caused signal degradation, or how to prevent interference. The equipment was fragile and required skilled operators. Stringing wires across the landscape required property rights and construction expertise. And fundamentally, people had to be convinced to pay for something they had never needed before.
Morse and his associates formed the Magnetic Telegraph Company to license the technology and build additional lines. Other inventors and entrepreneurs entered the field, some licensing Morse's patents, others developing alternative systems to avoid his patents. Competition emerged between different telegraph systems, different codes, and different business models. One of the key early decisions was the choice of who would operate the telegraph system. The postal service seemed a natural fit. In most European countries, telegraph systems would indeed be government-run monopolies, often as part of the post office. But in America, the telegraph developed as a private commercial enterprise. The Postmaster General declined the opportunity to purchase Morse's telegraph patent for the government, a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but which led to the development of a private telegraph industry that would eventually become one of the largest industries in America. The first commercial telegraph lines spread along natural corridors, alongside railroad tracks, which provided both right-of-way and a ready customer in the railroads themselves. Railway companies needed telegraphy desperately for safety and coordination. With trains running in both directions on single-track lines, accidents were an ever-present danger. The telegraph allowed dispatchers to communicate with stations, coordinate train movements, and prevent collisions. Railroad companies quickly became among the telegraph's biggest customers and often built their own telegraph lines along their tracks. As telegraph lines spread, the technology improved rapidly. The early receiving devices that made marks on paper tape required operators to decode the marks later. Operators quickly learned to interpret the clicking sounds the electromagnet made as it pulled and released. They could read incoming messages by ear faster than they could read the paper tape. The paper recording apparatus became superfluous for trained operators, though it remained useful for maintaining records. The key itself evolved from Morse's original design into the classic brass lever mounted on a wooden base that became iconic. Batteries improved, providing more reliable current. Insulators, the glass or ceramic knobs that held the wires to the poles while preventing electricity from leaking to ground, were refined. Methods for stringing and maintaining lines improved through trial and error. The code itself underwent refinement. The original Morse code used in America differed from the international Morse code developed later for European systems. Various nations and companies used slightly different codes until international standards gradually emerged. The principle remained the same: patterns of dots and dashes representing letters, with skilled operators sending and receiving at increasing speeds as they gained experience. One challenge that emerged was electrical resistance, the tendency of electrical current to weaken as it traveled through long wires. Early experimenters found that signals became too weak to detect after a certain distance. The solution came in the form of relays, intermediate stations where a weak incoming signal would trigger a local battery to send a fresh, strong signal onward to the next station. This relay principle allowed telegraph signals to travel unlimited distances, with messages being automatically repeated and strengthened at intervals. Another critical development was the realization that multiple messages could be sent over a single wire in different directions. Early operators had assumed that a wire could carry only one message at a time in one direction, requiring separate wires for each direction of communication.
But clever innovations allowed a single wire to carry messages in both directions simultaneously through careful timing and electrical tricks, doubling the capacity of existing lines without stringing additional wires. The human element of telegraphy developed its own culture. Telegraph operators, the men and women who sent and received messages by tapping keys and listening to clicking sounders, formed a distinct occupational community. They developed remarkable skills, with experienced operators able to send and receive 40, 50, or even 60 words per minute, their fingers flying over the keys in rhythmic patterns. They could recognize each other by their fist, the distinctive rhythm and style of each operator's keying, as individual as handwriting. Operators developed a professional culture with its own jargon, customs, and social networks. They would chat with each other over the wires during slow periods, developing friendships with operators in distant cities they would never meet in person. The telegraph wire became a social network decades before that term would be reinvented for the Internet age.
Women entered telegraphy in significant numbers, making it one of the first technical professions open to women. The work required intelligence, manual dexterity, and concentration, but not physical strength. Telegraph companies found that women made excellent operators, and telegraphy provided respectable, relatively well-paid employment for thousands of women in an era when career options were extremely limited. The technical challenges of early telegraphy could be severe. Wires broke in storms, requiring linemen to patrol lines to find and repair breaks. Insulators failed, allowing current to leak to ground. Batteries died and needed replacement. In winter, ice accumulated on wires, sometimes bringing them down. Lightning strikes could destroy equipment, and sabotage was an occasional problem. Vandals would cut wires, sometimes to rob the copper, sometimes simply for mischief. Despite these challenges, the telegraph spread with remarkable speed. By 1846, just 2 years after the Washington-Baltimore demonstration, telegraph lines connected New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Buffalo. By 1848, wires reached Chicago. By 1850, a network of telegraph lines covered much of the eastern United States, and the first lines had reached west of the Mississippi. In less than a decade, the telegraph had transformed from a laboratory curiosity to a commercial network reshaping American business and society. The technical challenges of early telegraphy could be severe. Wires broke in storms, requiring linemen to patrol lines to find and repair breaks. Insulators failed, allowing current to leak to ground. Batteries died and needed replacement. In winter, ice accumulated on wires, sometimes bringing them down. Lightning strikes could destroy equipment, and sabotage was an occasional problem. Vandals would cut wires, sometimes to rob the copper, sometimes simply for mischief. Despite these challenges, the telegraph spread with remarkable speed. By 1846, just 2 years after the Washington-Baltimore demonstration, telegraph lines connected New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Buffalo. By 1848, wires reached Chicago. By 1850, a network of telegraph lines covered much of the eastern United States, and the first lines had reached west of the Mississippi. In less than a decade, the telegraph had transformed from a laboratory curiosity to a commercial network reshaping American business and society. The content of telegraph messages in these early years reveals what people valued about instant communication. News services were among the first commercial users. Newspapers could obtain reports of events from correspondents in other cities within minutes rather than waiting days for mail delivery. Financial information flowed over the wires: stock prices, commodity prices, gold values, information that could mean profit or loss if acted upon quickly. Railroad companies coordinated train movements and reported delays. Businesses confirmed orders and checked on shipments. Government officials communicated about policy and crises. Personal messages were less common initially because telegraph service was expensive. A message might cost $1 or more, a significant sum when a laborer earned perhaps $1 a day. Telegrams were thus reserved for urgent matters: births, deaths, emergencies, or time-sensitive business. The cost and the public nature of telegraph messages — operators would read your message as they transcribed it — meant that private correspondence remained in the realm of letters sent by post. The language of telegrams evolved to minimize cost since messages were charged by the word.
People omitted articles, pronouns, and other unnecessary words, creating a terse style. Arrive Thursday, stop, meet station, stop, rather than I will arrive on Thursday, please meet me at the station. This telegraphic style influenced written communication more broadly, creating a precedent for concise business writing. Morse's patents became valuable as the telegraph spread, but they also became sources of bitter disputes. Other inventors claimed they had developed telegraph systems independently and that Morse's patents were invalid or too broad. Legal battles over patent infringement consumed years and significant money. The history of invention is rarely simple, and the telegraph was no exception. Multiple inventors had contributed ideas, and determining who deserved credit and profit was contentious. In Europe, telegraph development followed a different path. The Wheatstone-Cook system in Britain competed with various continental systems. Many European nations established telegraph as a government monopoly, building networks as public infrastructure rather than leaving development to private enterprise. The different approach reflected different political and economic systems. European governments had stronger traditions of state control over communications, dating from royal postal monopolies. International telegraphy required coordination between nations with different systems and protocols. Telegraph conferences began meeting to establish international standards for codes, procedures, and accounting for messages crossing borders. These early efforts at international technological cooperation were precursors to later international organizations governing telecommunications. By the early 1850s, the telegraph had proven itself as a revolutionary technology in the countries where it had been deployed. Messages that had taken days to deliver now arrived in minutes. Business could operate at new speeds. Newspapers could report distant events the same day they occurred. Governments could coordinate across their territories in real time. The world was beginning to shrink.
But the telegraph's full potential remained unrealized. Land telegraph lines, no matter how extensive, could connect only territories that could be reached by wires strung on poles or buried in the ground. The vast oceans remained barriers that telegraph could not cross. Messages from Europe to America still went by ship, taking 2 weeks or more. Information between continents traveled no faster in 1850 than it had in 1800. For the telegraph to truly shrink the world, it would need to cross the oceans. The very idea seemed preposterous. How could a wire be laid across 3,000 miles of ocean floor in water 3 miles deep? The challenges were immense, the costs staggering, the chances of success uncertain. Yet visionaries were already planning to attempt exactly that impossible feat. We have witnessed the birth of electrical telegraphy, from the laboratory experiments of Oersted and Ampere through the parallel inventions of Wheatstone, Cook, and Morse, to the moment when "What hath God wrought" first traveled through wires between Washington and Baltimore. We have seen the telegraph spread across America and Europe, creating networks that collapsed the time it took to communicate across hundreds of miles from days to minutes. The revolution had begun, but it remained limited by geography. Telegraph wires could run alongside roads and railways, could be strung through forests and over mountains, could even be laid in shallow rivers and coastal waters. But the deep oceans, those vast barriers that separated continents, seemed beyond the telegraph's reach. Yet, even as land telegraph networks expanded in the late 1940s and early 1950s, engineers and entrepreneurs were contemplating an audacious project that many considered impossible: laying a telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean floor. The distance was vast, the ocean depth unknown in many places, the technical challenges unprecedented. Critics argued it was a waste of money, that cables would fail under the pressure of deep water, that signals could not travel such distances, that ships could not accurately navigate while laying cable, that the whole enterprise was foolish speculation. But the rewards for success were equally vast. A cable linking America and Europe would mean that messages between New York and London would travel in minutes rather than weeks. Business, diplomacy, journalism, all would be transformed. The two great centers of Western civilization would be connected by a wire carrying thought at the speed of lightning. The world would shrink in a way never before possible.
In our next chapter, we will follow the extraordinary saga of the Transatlantic Cable, the brilliant engineers who designed it, the financiers who funded it, the ships that laid it, and the heartbreaking failures and triumphant success that eventually connected continents. We will experience the technical challenges of manufacturing and laying thousands of miles of submarine cable, the navigational difficulties, the cable breaks and losses, and finally the moment when Queen Victoria and President Buchanan exchanged messages across the Atlantic, proving that the ocean was no longer a barrier to instant communication. The telegraph had changed nations. Now it was about to change the world.
In our journey so far, we have traveled from a world where messages moved at the speed of horses to one where they raced through copper wires in an instant. We witnessed Samuel Morse tap out, "What hath God wrought?" and watched as telegraph lines spread across America and Europe, connecting cities that had been days apart, collapsing distance into irrelevance for those lucky enough to have wires connecting them. But now imagine standing on the shore of Newfoundland in the summer of 1858, looking out across the gray Atlantic Ocean toward Ireland, over 1,800 miles of empty water. Imagine contemplating a wire, a single strand of copper wrapped in insulation, lying on the ocean floor at depths of 2 and sometimes 3 miles, in cold and darkness no human has ever witnessed, stretching from one continent to another. Imagine the audacity of believing such a thing could work, that electrical signals could travel through such a cable, that ships could navigate well enough to lay it accurately, that it wouldn't simply break under its own weight or be destroyed by the crushing pressure of the deep ocean. To most people in the 1850s, the very idea seemed absurd, a fantasy born of excessive optimism and inadequate understanding of the challenges involved. The ocean was vast, deep, and hostile. No one had ever attempted anything remotely like this. The technical problems seemed insurmountable. The costs were staggering. The chances of failure overwhelmed the possibility of success. Yet a small group of visionaries, engineers, and financiers believed it could be done. They raised enormous sums of money, designed cables never before manufactured, chartered the largest ships in the world, and set out to accomplish what seemed impossible. They would fail repeatedly, heartbreakingly, expensively. Ships would break down, cables would snap, fortunes would be lost, reputations would be damaged, but they would persist, driven by the knowledge that success would mean something unprecedented in human history, that for the first time, messages could cross the Atlantic in minutes rather than weeks, that the ocean barrier could be conquered by a wire. This is the story of the most ambitious engineering project of the 19th century, of the submarine cables that wired the continents together and truly shrank the world overnight. The challenge of crossing the ocean with a telegraph wire was fundamentally different from building land telegraph lines. On land, wires could be strung from poles or buried in trenches. Repairs could be made quickly when wires broke, and the technology was well understood by the mid-1850s. But the ocean presented unique and daunting problems that would require entirely new technologies, unprecedented levels of capital investment, and a willingness to risk everything on an uncertain outcome. The concept of submarine telegraphy, running telegraph cables underwater, had been proven possible in small-scale applications before anyone seriously contemplated crossing oceans. In 1850, the first submarine telegraph cable was successfully laid across the English Channel, connecting Dover, England to Calais, France, a distance of about 25 miles. The cable, manufactured by the Gutta Percha Company, consisted of a copper conductor surrounded by gutta percha, a natural rubber-like material from Malaysian trees that provided waterproof insulation and protected by an outer sheath of iron wires. The English Channel cable initially failed. The first attempt in 1850 broke almost immediately, severed by a fisherman's anchor or possibly destroyed by curious fishermen who pulled up a section to examine it. But a second cable laid later that year succeeded, and for the first time, telegraph messages traveled under the sea. Britain and France could communicate instantly, a development with obvious commercial and political implications. The success of the Channel cable demonstrated that submarine telegraphy was possible, at least over relatively short distances in relatively shallow water.
Encouraged by this success, other submarine cables followed in quick succession. Cables crossed the Irish Sea connecting Britain to Ireland. Cables linked Denmark to Sweden across the Baltic Sea. In the Mediterranean, cables connected various islands and coastal cities. Each cable was a technical achievement. Each taught lessons about cable design and laying techniques, and each generated profits that demonstrated the commercial viability of submarine telegraphy. But all these early cables crossed relatively narrow bodies of water, dozens of miles, rarely more than 100. The depths were modest, usually a few hundred feet at most. Cables broke, they could sometimes be recovered and repaired. The distances were short enough that cable could be manufactured in continuous lengths or spliced together from shorter sections. These were substantial achievements, but they bore little relation to the challenge of crossing the Atlantic. The Atlantic Ocean between Ireland and Newfoundland spans roughly 1,800 nautical miles of open water. The ocean floor along much of the route lies at depths exceeding 2 miles, reaching nearly 3 miles in places. The cable would need to be manufactured in a continuous length or joined with perfect waterproof splices. It would need to withstand enormous pressure at depth, resist corrosion from seawater, maintain electrical insulation for the entire length, and be strong enough not to break under its own weight as it was laid from a ship. The cable would need to be embarked onto ships, carried across the ocean, and paid out in a controlled manner despite waves, currents, and storms.
No ship in the world in the early 1850s was large enough to carry 1,800 miles of heavy cable. The navigation required to lay the cable accurately was far beyond existing capabilities. Ships navigating by celestial observation could determine their position to within a few miles at best, hardly adequate for laying a precise underwater cable. The electrical theory of how signals would propagate through such a long cable was uncertain. Some scientists believed signals would degrade too much to be detectable after hundreds of miles. Yet, despite these formidable obstacles, one man became convinced that an Atlantic cable was not only possible but essential, and he dedicated himself to making it happen with a persistence that bordered on obsession. His name was Cyrus West Field, a wealthy American businessman with no technical training in telegraphy, but with vision, energy, and remarkable powers of persuasion. Field had made a fortune in the paper business before retiring at age 33, wealthy enough to pursue other interests. In 1854, he became interested in a proposal to build a telegraph line across Newfoundland, which would reduce the time for European news to reach New York by several days. Ships from Europe stopped at Newfoundland before sailing to American ports, and a telegraph across the island would allow news to be transmitted to the mainland ahead of the ship's arrival. While investigating this Newfoundland telegraph project, Field learned about the recent successes with submarine cables and had a grander vision. Why stop at Newfoundland? Why not run a cable from Newfoundland across the Atlantic to Ireland? Ships could carry messages to Newfoundland in perhaps 5 or 6 days from Europe, but a cable could deliver them in minutes. Or better yet, build the cable and eliminate the ships entirely, direct communication from New York to London. The idea seized Field's imagination entirely. For the next 12 years, from 1854 to 1866, the Atlantic cable would dominate his life, consuming his fortune, his health, and nearly his reputation. He would cross the Atlantic more than 50 times in pursuit of the project, endure public ridicule and private financial disaster, suffer through heartbreaking failures that seemed to prove his critics right, yet persist until he finally succeeded. Field's first task was to assemble a team of experts who could address the technical challenges. He recruited some of the finest engineering and scientific minds of the era. Charles Tilston Bright, a young British telegraph engineer, was appointed chief engineer. At age 25, he was already one of the foremost experts on submarine cables. Wildman Whitehouse, a surgeon with interests in electricity, became the company's electrician, responsible for electrical aspects of the cable and transmission equipment. Most crucially, Field obtained the support of William Thomson, a brilliant Scottish physicist and mathematician who would later become Lord Kelvin. Thomson provided the theoretical understanding of how electrical signals propagated through long cables and designed sensitive receiving instruments capable of detecting the weak signals that would emerge from 1,800 miles of cable.
His contributions were essential to the cable's eventual success, though initially his careful scientific approach conflicted with White House's more empirical methods. With his technical team assembled, Field needed financial backing on a scale never before attempted for a telegraph project. The Atlantic Cable would cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, eventually millions, to design, manufacture, and lay. No single investor or company could afford such a sum, so Field organized what became the Atlantic Telegraph Company, selling shares to raise capital in both Britain and America. The British government and the American government each pledged support in the form of annual subsidies if the cable succeeded, and critically, both governments agreed to provide naval vessels to assist in laying the cable.
The cable itself required unprecedented manufacturing efforts. The core consisted of 7 strands of pure copper wire twisted together to form a conductor about 1/16 of an inch thick. This was wrapped in 3 layers of gutta percha insulation, bringing the diameter to about 3/8 of an inch. Over this was wound a protective sheath of 18 iron wires, each wrapped with tarred hemp. The final cable was about 5/8 of an inch in diameter and weighed about 1 ton per mile. Manufacturing 1,800 miles of this cable, maintaining quality control to ensure no defects in the insulation or construction, and doing so to specifications never before attempted, was a massive industrial undertaking. The work was divided between 2 British cable manufacturers, Glass, Elliott and Company, and R.S. Newell and Company, each producing half the cable. The manufacturing took months, with every foot inspected and tested for electrical continuity and insulation integrity. As the cable was manufactured through 1857, it was coiled into the holds of 2 ships that would carry it across the Atlantic. The British government provided HMS Agamemnon, a ship of the line, and the American government provided USS Niagara, one of the largest warships in the U.S. Navy. Each ship was fitted with enormous cable tanks in their holds and with machinery for paying out the cable as the ships moved forward. The plan for the first expedition in 1857 was to have both ships meet mid-Atlantic, splice their cables together, then sail in opposite directions, Agamemnon toward Ireland, Niagara toward Newfoundland, simultaneously paying out cable until they reached shore at both ends. This approach would divide the strain of cable laying between 2 ships and allow the work to proceed from the middle outward. The first expedition departed in August 1857 with high hopes and enormous public interest. The ships met in mid-ocean as planned, spliced their cables together, and began sailing apart, paying out cable as they went. For several hours, everything went perfectly. Then, about 5 miles from the splice point, the cable in Niagara's hold snagged, the brake mechanism failed to stop the cable from running out, and the cable parted with a snap. The broken end plunged into the ocean and was lost in 2 miles of water. It was a disappointing failure, but an instructive one. The expedition returned to port, the cable manufacturers provided additional cable to replace what had been lost, and planning began for a second attempt in 1858. The cable-laying machinery was improved, better brakes were installed, and procedures were revised based on lessons learned. The second expedition in June 1858 again attempted the mid-ocean start, but this time encountered severe weather. In a violent storm, Agamemnon rolled desperately in heavy seas, and the cable in her tanks broke loose, thrashing about and tangling. The ship barely survived, and the cable was damaged beyond use. Once again, the expedition had to return in failure. 2 attempts, 2 failures, and enormous sums of money spent with nothing to show for it. Public opinion was turning against the project. Newspapers published skeptical articles questioning whether the Atlantic Cable was a practical proposition or merely a scheme to separate investors from their money. Scientists pointed out the theoretical difficulties with signal transmission over such distances. Practical men noted that 2 failures suggested fundamental problems rather than bad luck. The company's stock price fell. Some investors demanded their money back. Field faced ridicule and accusations of wasting public funds. Yet Field persisted, and he convinced enough of his backers to make one more attempt. In July 1858, the ships departed for a 3rd try. This time, fortune smiled on the endeavor.
The weather was calm, the machinery worked correctly, and the mid-ocean splice was completed successfully. Agamemnon and Niagara separated and began paying out cable. For days, the ships moved slowly apart, carefully managing the speed of cable payout to match the ship's speed over the ocean floor. Too fast, and the cable would break under its own weight. Too slow, and excess cable would pile on the ocean bottom in loose coils. The ships crept westward and eastward at just a few miles per hour, their crews watching the cable run out with agonizing slowness, knowing that at any moment a snag, a defect in the cable, or a navigation error could end the attempt. The cable broke several times during the laying, each time requiring the ships to stop, recover the broken end from the ocean floor, a difficult operation involving grappling hooks and luck, splice on new cable, and resume. Each break consumed hours or days and raised fears that the attempt would fail, but each time the crews succeeded in recovering the cable and continuing.
The Great Eastern was a leviathan by the standards of the 1860s, nearly 700 feet long, displacing over 20,000 tons, powered by both paddle wheels and a screw propeller. Its cavernous holds could accommodate the entire 1,800 miles of Atlantic cable, plus all the necessary equipment and supplies. It was stable enough to handle the cable-laying operation in rough seas, powerful enough to maintain precise speeds, and large enough to carry hundreds of crew and workers needed for the operation. In 1865, preparations began for a new Atlantic cable attempt using the Great Eastern. The cable was redesigned based on the failures of 1858, larger conductor for better signal transmission, better quality gutta percha insulation, stronger protective armor, more rigorous testing during manufacture. The new cable was heavier and stronger than the 1858 cable, weighing about 1 3/4 tons per mile. The cable was manufactured by the Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company, a firm formed specifically to manufacture submarine cables, incorporating the lessons of previous failures. Every foot of cable was tested during manufacture. The cable was loaded onto the Great Eastern in 3 enormous coils and specially designed tanks, a process that took weeks and required careful handling to avoid kinking or damaging the cable. In July 1865, the Great Eastern departed from Valencia Bay, Ireland, and headed west, paying out cable as it went. Unlike the 1858 expeditions, this time the laying began at the eastern end and proceeded to the western end, and the single ship carried all the cable, eliminating the complexity of mid-ocean operations. For days, the laying proceeded well. The weather cooperated, the cable ran out smoothly, the electrical signals transmitted from shore indicated the cable was functioning properly. Over 1,200 miles of cable had been successfully laid, and success seemed assured. Then, about 600 miles from Newfoundland, disaster struck. The cable broke. Despite careful monitoring and control, a flaw in the cable or an error in handling caused it to snap. The broken end fell into the ocean in water over 2 miles deep. The crew attempted to recover it using grappling hooks, hoping to pull up the cable, splice on new cable, and continue. For days they tried, dragging grappling hooks across the ocean floor in the approximate location where the cable had fallen. Several times they actually hooked the cable and began hauling it up from the depths, only to have it slip off the grappling hook or break under the strain before it reached the surface. After numerous attempts, with the weather deteriorating and supplies running low, the Great Eastern abandoned the effort and returned to Britain. The 1865 expedition, like its predecessors, had ended in failure, with over 1,000 miles of expensive cable lying useless on the Atlantic floor. The 1865 failure might have ended the Atlantic Cable project forever. The company had lost enormous sums. Investors had seen no return. 3 major expeditions had failed. Critics argued that the project was cursed, that the technical challenges were simply too great, that the money should be spent on more reliable means of communication. Field himself was nearly bankrupted by the repeated failures.
Yet, once again, a core group of believers persisted. The Telegraph Construction and Maintenance Company agreed to manufacture new cable and to provide much of the financing itself, betting on future profits. The Great Eastern was chartered for another attempt. New cable was manufactured, incorporating further improvements. Additional grappling equipment was designed for recovering lost cable. Plans were made not only to lay a new cable in 1866, but also to attempt to recover the 1865 cable and complete it. On July 13, 1866, the Great Eastern departed from Valencia Bay, Ireland, and headed west, paying out cable as it went. This time, everything worked. The weather was favorable, the cable ran out smoothly day after day, the electrical signals remained strong and clear. Thomson's sensitive galvanometers detected signals perfectly. The crew had learned from all previous failures and operated with practiced efficiency. On July 27, 1866, just 2 weeks after departing Ireland, the Great Eastern reached Heart's Content in Newfoundland. The cable was brought ashore and connected to land telegraph lines. The Atlantic Telegraph Company sent a message to Britain. Heart's Content, July 27th. We arrived here at 9 o'clock this morning. All well. Thank God the cable is laid and is in perfect working order. The cable worked. Messages began flowing immediately, transmitted at speeds far exceeding the 1858 cable. A message that had taken 16 hours to transmit in 1858 now took only minutes. The electrical design was sound, the manufacturing quality was high, and Thomson's receiving instruments performed beautifully. This cable would continue operating for many years.
On August 5, 1858, after 2 weeks of cable laying, Agamemnon reached Valencia Bay on the Irish coast. The cable was brought ashore and connected to land telegraph lines. On the same day, Niagara reached Trinity Bay in Newfoundland. The cable was brought ashore there and also connected to land lines. The Atlantic cable was complete. The achievement was announced to the world, and the reaction was euphoric. Church bells rang in cities across America and Britain. Newspapers proclaimed it the greatest engineering achievement of the century. Celebrations and fireworks marked the success. In New York, a torchlight parade drew such crowds that City Hall caught fire from celebratory fireworks and was badly damaged. Cyrus Field was hailed as a hero, vindicated after years of ridicule. On August 16, 1858, Queen Victoria sent a message to President James Buchanan, 99 words of congratulation on the successful completion of the cable. The transmission took over 16 hours because the signals were extremely weak and transmission speeds were very slow, but the message got through. Buchanan replied with his own message, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the age of instant transatlantic communication had arrived. But the celebration was premature. The cable was failing. The signals, weak from the beginning, were growing weaker. Whitehouse, the company's electrician, had insisted on using very high voltage to force signals through the cable, believing this would improve transmission. Thomson had warned that high voltage would damage the cable's insulation, but Whitehouse had prevailed. Thomson was proved right. The high voltages were breaking down the gutta percha insulation, allowing the electrical signal to leak into the seawater. The cable struggled along for a few weeks, transmitting messages at painfully slow rates, sometimes just a few words per hour. Over 700 messages were sent in total, including diplomatic and commercial traffic. But the signal deteriorated day by day. By early September, barely a month after the cable began operation, signals had become too weak to read. On September 1, 1858, the cable fell silent and never transmitted another message. The failure was devastating. Critics who had been silenced by the cable's success now redoubled their attacks. Some claimed the whole thing had been a fraud, that the cable had never really worked at all, that the messages had been faked. Field and the Atlantic Telegraph Company faced accusations of deception and incompetence. The company's stock became worthless. Investors who had celebrated in August were ruined by October. Yet the failure, while financially disastrous, was technically instructive. An investigation into why the cable failed revealed the damage caused by Whitehouse's high-voltage transmission and vindicated Thomson's more conservative approach.
The experience demonstrated that while an Atlantic cable was possible, it required better design, better manufacturing quality control, better cable handling during laying, and better electrical engineering. The 1858 cable had proven the concept. Messages had crossed the Atlantic through an underwater wire, but it had also revealed how much remained to be learned. For the next several years, the Atlantic Cable project lay dormant. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 absorbed American attention and capital, making it impossible to raise funds for another attempt. In Britain, the financial losses from the 1858 cable made investors wary. Field spent these years traveling, lobbying, trying to maintain interest and raise funds, but the appetite for another expensive gamble had evaporated. During this hiatus, submarine cable technology advanced significantly based on lessons from the Atlantic Cable and from other submarine cables laid successfully during this period. Cables were laid across the Mediterranean, connecting Europe to North Africa and the Middle East. The Red Sea was crossed by cable. In 1865, a cable connected British India to Britain via the Middle East and the Mediterranean, reducing communication time from months to hours. Each cable taught lessons about design, materials, and laying techniques. The manufacturing quality of cables improved dramatically. Testing methods became more rigorous. The electrical theory of long-distance transmission was better understood, with Thomson's mathematical work providing a foundation. The importance of signal detection equipment was recognized. Thomson designed a mirror galvanometer, an extremely sensitive instrument that could detect signals far weaker than anything previous instruments could register. But the single most important development was the construction of a ship specifically designed for cable laying, a ship so large it could carry the entire Atlantic cable in a single hold, eliminating the complexity and risk of mid-ocean splices. This ship, the Great Eastern, was originally built as a passenger liner but had been a commercial failure due to its enormous size and operating costs. In 1864, it was chartered for cable laying, and suddenly its very size, its greatest liability as a passenger ship, became its greatest asset. But the Great Eastern wasn't finished. Having successfully laid the 1866 cable, the ship returned to the spot where the 1865 cable had been lost and attempted to recover it. Using improved grappling equipment and benefiting from calm weather, the crew successfully hooked the lost cable, raised it from over 2 miles beneath the surface, brought the end aboard the Great Eastern, tested it and found it still operational, spliced on new cable, and completed the laying to Newfoundland. By September 1866, 2 working cables connected Europe and America. The Atlantic had been conquered. The project that had consumed 12 years, cost millions of pounds, failed repeatedly, and been dismissed as impossible, had succeeded. Cyrus Field, who had endured ridicule and financial ruin, was vindicated. The engineers and workers who had persisted through failure after failure were proven right. The impact was immediate and profound. News that had taken 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic by ship now transmitted in minutes. Financial markets in London and New York, previously operating independently with information delays of weeks, now influenced each other in near real time. Businesses could coordinate transatlantic operations in ways never before possible. Governments could conduct diplomacy with responses in hours rather than months. The distance between Europe and America didn't disappear, but for communication purposes, it became almost irrelevant. The first messages sent over the cable in 1866 included diplomatic communications, financial information, and personal messages from dignitaries. Queen Victoria sent another message to the American president, this time Andrew Johnson, congratulating him on the cable's success. Business immediately began using the cable for commercial intelligence, commodity prices, stock quotations, shipping information. The cable charged by the word, and the rates were expensive, initially several dollars per word, later declining but still substantial. This meant that cable messages were reserved for important information where the value of speed justified the cost. A businessman might spend $50 to send a 10-word message if that information could save or make thousands of dollars. News services paid premium rates to transmit stories hours or days before mail steamers could deliver them. The language of cable messages became even more compressed than land telegraph messages. People created code books where single words represented complex phrases, allowing more information to be packed into fewer billable words. Affirm might mean accept the proposal as stated in my previous message. Decline might mean reject the proposal and await our counteroffer. Elaborate commercial codes developed, allowing businesses to communicate complex instructions in terse messages. The success of the Atlantic Cable immediately sparked efforts to lay cables to other parts of the world. If the Atlantic could be crossed, why not other oceans and seas? The late 1860s and 1870s saw an explosion of submarine cable laying as companies and governments raced to connect continents and create a global telegraph network. In 1869 and 1870, a cable was successfully laid from Britain to India, providing direct telegraph communication to Britain's most important colony. The route went through the Mediterranean, across Egypt, through the Red Sea, and across the Indian Ocean, over 8,000 miles of cable, much of it in deep water, representing an engineering achievement even more complex than the Atlantic Cable. Messages from London to Bombay, which had taken months by ship, now took hours by telegraph. Cables reached Australia in 1872, connecting that distant continent to the global network. The route went from Singapore through the Dutch East Indies to the Australian coast, then overland across Australia to the major cities. Australians, who had been more isolated from world events than almost any other region, suddenly could receive news from Europe the same day events occurred. South America was connected by cables in the 1870s, with lines running from Europe to Brazil and from North America down the west coast. Africa was gradually wired, with cables connecting coastal cities and eventually running inland. By 1880, a network of submarine cables connected every continent except Antarctica, creating a global communication system that would have seemed like magic just 30 years earlier. The All-Red Line, a British imperial telegraph system using cables and landlines entirely on British territory, circled the globe by the 1990s, allowing messages to travel from London to India to Singapore to Australia and back to London entirely on infrastructure controlled by Britain. This gave Britain enormous advantages in diplomacy, trade, and imperial administration, as information could flow through the empire faster than through other nations' systems. The cables didn't just connect major cities, they also served isolated outposts and islands. Cable stations were established on remote islands like Ascension Island in the South Atlantic, serving as relay points for long cables. These tiny specks of land in the ocean suddenly became important nodes in the global communication network. The operators stationed at these remote cable stations lived isolated lives, but performed crucial functions in maintaining global communications. The technology of submarine cables continued to improve through the late 19th century. Cables became more reliable, lasting decades rather than years. Duplex transmission systems allowed messages to be sent in both directions simultaneously over a single cable, doubling capacity. Repeaters and improved detection equipment increased transmission speeds. Manufacturing quality improved, reducing failures. Ships specialized for cable laying were built, replacing converted warships and passenger liners. The laying of cables became a specialized industry, employing thousands of workers. Cable ships patrolled the oceans, laying new cables and repairing broken ones. The ships carried miles of spare cable and sophisticated equipment for locating and recovering broken cables from the ocean floor. When a cable broke, from ship's anchors, underwater landslides, or simply wear, cable ships would respond, find the break using electrical testing from shore stations, recover both ends of the broken cable, splice in new cable, and restore service. The economics of submarine cables created interesting patterns of development. Cables were laid where they could generate enough traffic to justify their enormous costs. This meant connecting wealthy, commercially active regions first. Britain, as the world's leading commercial power and hub of a global empire, became the center of the cable network, with more cables terminating in Britain than any other nation. The United States, as a major trading partner and economic power, was also heavily connected. Less wealthy regions were connected later, if at all. Africa's interior, much of Central Asia, the Pacific Islands, these regions received cable connections slowly, if ever, because the traffic and revenue didn't justify the investment. This created a communication divide, where some regions enjoyed instant global communication while others remained isolated, dependent on ships and traditional mail. The strategic importance of submarine cables became apparent quickly. Cables carried not just commercial, but diplomatic and military information. In wartime, controlling cables was crucial. During conflicts, nations would attempt to cut enemy cables while protecting their own. Cable stations and cable ships became military targets. The geographic routes of cables influenced naval strategy. Controlling islands along cable routes meant controlling communications. Britain's dominance of the cable industry gave it substantial advantages. British companies manufactured most cables. British ships laid most cables. British capital financed most cables, and cables often ran through British territory or waters. This meant Britain had access to and, in wartime, control over much of the world's long-distance communication. Other nations, particularly Germany and the United States, viewed this British dominance with concern and worked to develop their own cable networks. The social impact of global cables was subtle but profound. For the first time in history, an event on one continent could be known on another continent within hours. When a diplomatic crisis erupted in Europe, newspapers in America could report it the same day. When stock markets crashed in London, investors in New York knew immediately. When disasters occurred, earthquakes, floods, famines, the world learned quickly and could respond with aid. This instant global awareness created what some historians call the first global village, a world where distance no longer protected regions from knowing about or being affected by distant events. Financial crises could spread globally in hours through cable-transmitted panic. Diplomatic incidents could escalate before cooler heads prevailed because instant communication allowed quick reactions but didn't necessarily allow time for reflection. The news industry was transformed by submarine cables. News agencies like Reuters in Britain, Associated Press in America, and Havas in France established themselves as cable news gatherers and distributors. They maintained correspondents worldwide who would cable stories to headquarters, which would then distribute them to newspapers. The cable costs were enormous, so news agencies economized by sending only the most important stories and condensing them to minimize words. This economic pressure shaped news coverage in ways still visible today. News became more event-focused and less analytical because analysis required more words. Cables privileged facts over context, action over explanation, the sensational over the mundane. The who, what, when, where style of news writing emerged partly from the economics of cable transmission. Get the essential facts in the fewest words. Financial markets became globally interconnected through cables. Prices for commodities like wheat, cotton, gold, and silver in London, New York, and other major markets could be compared instantly. Arbitrage opportunities disappeared quickly as traders exploited price differences before they could persist. The cable created more efficient but also more volatile markets, as shocks in one market instantly affected others. The cost of cable transmission gradually declined as more cables were laid and competition increased, but it remained expensive enough that cable use was largely limited to businesses, governments, and news organizations. Ordinary people still sent personal correspondence by mail. A letter might take 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic, but it cost a few cents, whereas a cable cost several dollars. The very wealthy might send personal cables for urgent family matters, but for most people, the cable remained a commercial and governmental tool. The expansion of the cable network continued into the 20th century. Additional Atlantic cables were laid as traffic increased beyond what the early cables could handle. The Pacific was crossed by cables in several routes, connecting America to Asia. More routes to South America, Africa, and Asia were established. By the early 1900s, the world was thoroughly wired, with redundant routes ensuring that cutting a single cable couldn't isolate a region. The technical achievement represented by this global cable network is difficult to overstate. Hundreds of thousands of miles of cable lay on ocean floors, in some places at depths exceeding 5 miles. The cable routes had to be carefully surveyed, avoiding underwater mountains and steep slopes where cables might break. The cables had to withstand enormous pressure, resist corrosion, maintain electrical insulation for decades, and remain operational despite ships' anchors, fishing nets, and natural hazards.
The reliability of the cables improved dramatically over time. Early cables, like the 1858 Atlantic cable, failed within months. Later cables lasted decades with minimal maintenance. The 1866 Atlantic cable continued operating until 1872, when it was retired not because it failed, but because higher capacity cables had been laid. Some cables laid in the 1880s continued operating into the mid-20th century, a testament to improved design and manufacturing. By 1900, the submarine cable network represented one of the largest capital investments and most complex technological systems in the world. The cables themselves were valuable. They cost millions to manufacture and lay. The ships that maintained them were specialized and expensive. The shore stations with their trained operators and sensitive equipment required ongoing investment. The system employed tens of thousands of people worldwide. Yet for all this investment and complexity, the system worked largely invisibly. Messages entered at one cable station, traveled through thousands of miles of underwater cable and overland wires, and emerged at a distant station, the physical journey hidden from the sender and receiver. The technology became transparent, a utility taken for granted, its complexity and achievement visible only when it failed. The period from the 1850s to the 1880s, when the global cable network was built, represents one of the most remarkable technological achievements in history. In just 3 decades, humanity went from struggling to cross the English Channel with a cable to having wires connecting every continent, carrying messages around the world in hours. The planet had shrunk, distance had been conquered, and instantaneous global communication had become routine for those who could afford it. We have witnessed one of history's great engineering triumphs, the conquest of the oceans by cables, the wiring together of continents, the creation of a global communication network that shrank the world in ways our ancestors could barely have imagined. We stood with Cyrus Field through 12 years of failure and persistence, rode with the Great Eastern as it paid out cable across the Atlantic, and watched as the network expanded to every corner of the globe. By the 1870s, the physical infrastructure was largely complete. Cables crossed every ocean, connected every continent, linked the great cities of the world into a network that could transmit messages globally in hours. The engineering challenge had been met, the technical problem solved, and the investment made. The world was wired. But infrastructure alone doesn't change society. It's how people use that infrastructure that matters. The telegraph cables created potential for transformation, but it took decades for that potential to be fully realized. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the telegraph actually changed Victorian society, how it transformed business, journalism, government, and daily life. We will discover why contemporaries called it the Victorian Internet, and how it created patterns of communication and social change that would echo through the telephone era, the radio age, and eventually into our own Internet age. We will visit the bustling telegraph offices where operators tapped out messages in Morse code at lightning speed, where fortunes were made and lost based on information arriving seconds before competitors received it. We will see how the telegraph created standard time zones, how it enabled modern financial markets, how it changed warfare and diplomacy, how it affected language and culture, and how it created new anxieties about speed, information overload, and the pace of modern life. Anxieties that sound remarkably familiar to those we experience with our own communication technologies. The wires were laid. Now we will explore what traveled through them and how those dots and dashes, those electrical pulses racing through copper cables under oceans and across continents, transformed human society in ways both obvious and subtle, ways we are still experiencing today. The Victorian Internet awaits, a world connected by wires, communicating in coded clicks, where distance had been conquered, but humanity was still learning what that conquest meant.
We have watched the telegraph evolve from Samuel Morse's first experimental apparatus to a global network of wires stretching across continents and under oceans. We have witnessed the extraordinary engineering achievement of the submarine cables, the persistence required to connect Europe and America, and the rapid expansion that wired the world together by the 1870s. The infrastructure was built,
the technical challenges overcome, and the physical network complete. But now imagine stepping into a telegraph office in London or New York or San Francisco in the 1870s. The air crackles with the sound of dozens of telegraph sounders clicking rhythmically, each one a stream of dots and dashes pouring in from distant cities. Operators, both men and women, sit at their instruments, their fingers dancing over the keys as they send messages, or their pencils flying across paper as they transcribe incoming signals. The office hums with urgent activity, messages arriving every minute reporting stock prices from across the ocean, news of political developments from distant capitals, business instructions from company headquarters, personal emergencies from family members far away. This is the nerve center of the modern world, the place where information from around the globe converges and is distributed, where the instantaneous communication network that had seemed impossible just decades before has become routine, essential, taken for granted. The telegraph operators working here are the gatekeepers of information, the human interfaces between senders and receivers separated by thousands of miles, but connected by copper wires. Through their fingers flows the commerce, journalism, diplomacy, and personal communication of an increasingly interconnected world. The most immediate and dramatic impact of the telegraph was on business and commerce. Before the telegraph, business had operated with the friction of distance and time. Information took days, weeks, or months to travel, creating uncertainties and inefficiencies that were simply accepted as inevitable. The telegraph removed this friction for those who could afford it, creating new possibilities and new competitive pressures that transformed commerce fundamentally. Consider the experience of a merchant in New York in the 1840s, before the telegraph. If he wanted to know the price of cotton in New Orleans or wheat in Chicago, he would have to wait for price reports to arrive by mail, which might take a week or more. By the time he received the information, prices might have changed substantially. He had to make decisions based on old information, gambling that conditions hadn't shifted too much in the intervening days. If he wanted to coordinate with a business partner in another city, every exchange of messages required days or weeks, meaning that negotiations moved at a glacial pace and conditions might change before agreements could be finalized. Now imagine the same merchant in the 1870s, after the telegraph lines connected every major city. He could walk to the telegraph office and within minutes receive the current price of cotton in New Orleans, wheat in Chicago, or manufactured goods in Philadelphia. If prices were favorable, he could immediately send orders to buy or sell, executing transactions based on current rather than outdated information. If he needed to negotiate with a business partner, the exchange of proposals and counterproposals could occur within hours rather than weeks. The telegraph collapsed the time required for business communication from weeks to minutes, fundamentally changing the pace and nature of commerce. This acceleration had profound effects on markets. Commodity prices in different cities, which had previously varied widely because information traveled slowly, began to converge. If wheat was cheap in Chicago and expensive in New York, merchants would learn of this price difference immediately via telegraph, buy in Chicago and ship to New York, and the price difference would quickly disappear as supply and demand adjusted. Markets became more efficient in the economic sense. Prices reflected supply and demand more accurately because information about both traveled instantly. But this efficiency came with new volatility. Before the telegraph, a financial panic in London might take weeks to affect New York, giving American businessmen time to prepare or adjust. After the telegraph, panic could spread in hours as news transmitted instantly and investors reacted immediately. The telegraph connected markets geographically, but also connected them psychologically. Fear and optimism could ripple across continents at the speed of electricity. The creation of standardized market information was another crucial development. Before the telegraph, businessmen gathered information through personal networks, letters from correspondents, newspapers that arrived by mail, and traders' gossip in coffee houses and exchanges. Information was fragmented, often unreliable, and arrived at different times for different people. The telegraph enabled the creation of news services that distributed standardized market information simultaneously to all subscribers. This is the story of how the telegraph changed society,
how those wires strung across the landscape and those cables lying on ocean floors transformed business, journalism, government, and daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. It is the story of what historians call the Victorian Internet, the first time humanity experienced instant global communication and grappled with the opportunities, challenges, and anxieties that came with it.
The most important of these was Reuters, founded by Paul Julius Reuter in London in 1851. Reuter recognized that the telegraph created opportunities for selling information. He established a network of correspondents in major commercial centers who would telegraph news of prices, political developments, and significant events to Reuters' headquarters in London. Reuters would then distribute this information to subscribing newspapers, banks, and businesses, charging fees for the service. Within a few years, Reuters had become indispensable to anyone who needed timely information about global markets and events. Similar news agencies emerged in other countries, the Associated Press in America, Havas in France, Wolf in Germany. These agencies formed cartels, dividing up the world into territories and agreeing not to compete in each other's regions. Reuters dominated the British Empire, Associated Press covered the Americas, Havas took continental Europe and parts of the French Empire, and Wolf served Central Europe. This cartel arrangement meant that a relatively small number of organizations controlled the flow of telegraphic news worldwide, raising questions about information monopolies that would resurface with later communication technologies. Financial markets were perhaps the most thoroughly transformed by the telegraph. Stock exchanges had existed for centuries, but they had operated as local or at most regional institutions. Information about companies, economic conditions, and investment opportunities traveled slowly, and stock prices reflected local knowledge and sentiment as much as fundamental business conditions. The telegraph created the possibility of national and eventually international financial markets, where information traveled instantly and prices adjusted continuously. In the United States, the telegraph enabled the growth of Wall Street as the nation's financial center. Before the telegraph, stock trading occurred in multiple cities. Philadelphia, Boston, and New York all had significant exchanges, but the telegraph allowed New York to consolidate its dominance because traders there could obtain information from across the country instantly and execute trades based on that information. Businesses wanting to raise capital increasingly listed their stock in New York because that's where the most information and the most active trading occurred. The telegraph also created new financial instruments and trading strategies. Futures markets, where traders bought and sold contracts for future delivery of commodities, expanded dramatically because the telegraph allowed traders to hedge risks based on current information about supply and demand. Arbitrage, exploiting price differences between markets, became more sophisticated and rapid, with traders telegraphing orders to buy in one market and sell in another within minutes of learning about price differences. Perhaps most significantly, the telegraph helped create the modern financial ticker, a specialized telegraph device that continuously printed stock prices on a paper tape. Invented by Edward Callahan in 1867 and improved by Thomas Edison and others, the stock ticker allowed traders to monitor price movements continuously without having to go to the exchange floor or wait for delayed price reports. Brokerages and trading firms installed tickers in their offices, and the continuous stream of prices, the ticker tape, became central to financial markets. The phrase ticker tape parade comes from the practice of throwing used ticker tape from office windows during celebrations. The pace of business accelerated to match the speed of telegraph communication. Businessmen who had previously been content to wait days or weeks for replies to letters now expected responses to telegrams within hours or even minutes. Companies opened telegraph accounts and assigned clerks specifically to handle telegraph communications. The business day expanded as telegrams arrived from different time zones throughout the day and night. Some businesses operated around the clock to monitor telegraph messages from distant markets and respond to opportunities. This acceleration created stress as well as opportunity. The leisurely pace of business correspondence, where one could compose thoughtful letters and await replies while attending to other matters, gave way to a more frantic rhythm where immediate responses were expected and delays could mean lost opportunities.
Businessmen complained about the pressure to respond instantly to telegraph messages, the difficulty of making complex decisions quickly, and the feeling of being constantly available and never able to escape business demands.
The language of business communication changed to adapt to telegraph economics. Since telegrams were charged by the word, brevity became essential. Business communications that had been elaborated in letters became terse telegrams. "We accept your proposal of the 15th instant and will arrange shipment as discussed," became "accept 15th, ship ASAP." The flowery language of Victorian correspondence, the elaborate salutations, the courteous phrases, the formal closings, disappeared from telegrams, replaced by stark efficiency. Codebooks developed to compress information further. Companies created elaborate codes where a single word represented entire phrases or complex instructions. Boston might mean accept the proposal but request delayed payment terms. Chicago might mean reject the proposal and submit our counteroffer per previous discussion. These codes served dual purposes. They reduced telegraph costs, and they provided confidentiality, since anyone intercepting a telegram would see only meaningless code words. The railroad industry became perhaps the most enthusiastic adopter of telegraph technology, because for railroads, the telegraph solved existential problems. Before the telegraph, coordinating train movements on a single track used by trains traveling in both directions was extremely difficult and dangerous. Stations had to estimate when trains would arrive and depart, hope that trains stayed on schedule, and pray that opposing trains didn't meet on a stretch of single track with nowhere to pass. Accidents were common and often deadly. The telegraph allowed dispatchers to know exactly where every train was, to communicate with station agents along the line, and to issue instructions to hold trains or proceed based on real-time information about track conditions and other trains' positions. The first railroad telegraph lines in the 1840s and 1850s led to dramatic improvements in safety and efficiency. Trains could run more frequently because dispatchers could manage traffic flow precisely. Express trains could overtake slower freight trains by coordinating holds at sidings. Accidents from trains colliding decreased substantially. Railroads built extensive telegraph networks alongside their tracks, often sharing poles, telegraph wires strung on the upper crossbars, with space reserved for future telephone wires on lower crossbars. Railroad companies became major telegraph operators, sometimes earning more from commercial telegraph traffic than from passenger revenue, since their wires connected every town along their routes and they could sell capacity to businesses and the public. The transformation of journalism was as dramatic as the transformation of business. Before the telegraph, newspapers had been intensely local, printing news from their own cities, plus whatever reports arrived by mail from correspondents in other places. Foreign news might be months old. Newspapers in New York in 1840 printed European news from newspapers that had arrived on ships, typically 6 to 8 weeks after events occurred. News from other American cities was days or weeks old, depending on distance and mail service quality. The telegraph transformed newspapers into vehicles for current news, reporting events from around the country and eventually around the world on the same day or at most the day after they occurred. The very concept of news changed. Before the telegraph, news was information about events whenever you learned of them. After the telegraph, news was information about recent events, and the recency was crucial. Week-old news from Europe was no longer news, it was history. This transformation created new demands on journalism. Newspapers needed correspondents in distant cities who could telegraph stories. They needed telegraph clerks to receive the incoming messages and editors to compile them into coherent reports. They needed larger budgets to pay for telegraph transmission. Sending a 1,000-word story from London to New York might cost $50 to $100, a substantial sum when a newspaper sold for a few cents. The economics of telegraph transmission shaped news coverage in ways still visible today. Correspondents learned to write in a style that put the most important information first, the inverted pyramid structure, where the first paragraph contained the essential facts and subsequent paragraphs provided details in descending order of importance. This structure emerged from the practical concern that telegraph transmission might be interrupted. If the wire went down after 3 paragraphs, at least readers would know the essential facts. It also allowed editors to cut stories from the bottom to fit available space without losing crucial information.
The telegraph also reinforced a distinction between fact and opinion in journalism. Sending analysis and interpretation via expensive telegraph was wasteful. Better to send facts and let local editors add context and opinion. This created a wire service style that was deliberately neutral and factual, leaving interpretation to individual newspapers. The Associated Press, which distributed news via telegraph to member newspapers across America, adopted policies of objectivity and neutrality, partly because its diverse membership included papers with different political leanings, and partly because neutrality was more efficient for telegraph transmission. News agencies became enormously powerful because they controlled access to telegraphic news. A newspaper that wasn't an Associated Press member in America or a Reuters subscriber in Britain couldn't compete with papers that received telegraphic news services. The agencies could essentially determine what was news simply by choosing what to transmit. Events that weren't telegraphed didn't become news, even if they were significant. The agency's judgments about what was important enough to telegraph shaped public knowledge and awareness. The telegraph created the concept of a scoop, getting news before competitors. Before the telegraph, having news a day or two before other papers was valuable, but not crucial. After the telegraph, having news even an hour before competitors could mean substantially higher sales for that edition. Newspapers competed fiercely to get stories onto the wire first, sometimes resorting to questionable tactics like bribing telegraph operators to delay competitors' messages or cutting telegraph wires to prevent rivals from transmitting.
War correspondence was revolutionized by the telegraph. The Crimean War in the 1850s was the first conflict where correspondents could telegraph reports, though the technology was still primitive and the costs high. By the American Civil War in the 1860s, telegraph reports from battlefields reached newspapers within hours, and the public could follow military campaigns almost in real time. This immediacy created new pressures on military commanders, who found their decisions scrutinized in newspapers before outcomes were known, and new security concerns, as telegraphed information about troop movements might reach the enemy as quickly as it reached the public. The telegraph also transformed government and diplomacy. Before the telegraph, ambassadors and colonial governors operated with substantial independence simply because waiting months for instructions from the home government was impractical. Ambassadors negotiated based on general guidance, but with wide latitude for initiative. Colonial governors made decisions knowing their superiors wouldn't learn of them for weeks or months. The telegraph changed this by allowing central governments to maintain much tighter control over distant officials. An ambassador could now wire home for instructions and receive them within hours. A colonial governor faced with a decision could consult with London or Paris or Amsterdam before acting. This centralization of authority made governance more uniform, but also potentially more rigid, as officials on the ground who understood local conditions might be overruled by distant superiors, operating on imperfect information transmitted by telegram. Diplomatic crises could escalate more rapidly because of the telegraph. Before instant communication, there was built-in delay that sometimes allowed tempers to cool or gave diplomats time to craft careful responses. After the telegraph, governments could exchange heated messages rapidly, and public opinion could be inflamed by telegraphed reports before diplomats had time to negotiate. Some historians argue that the telegraph contributed to the outbreak of World War I by allowing crises to spiral out of control more quickly than would have occurred with slower communication. The telegraph also revealed diplomatic secrets more readily. Encrypted telegrams could be intercepted and potentially decoded, creating security concerns that hadn't existed with diplomatic pouches carried by trusted couriers. Governments developed increasingly sophisticated codes and ciphers for telegraphic communication, and cryptography became a significant concern for foreign ministries. The British, who controlled many of the cable routes, could and did read other nations' telegrams during conflicts, providing enormous intelligence advantages. One of the most visible impacts of the telegraph was the creation of standard time zones. Before the telegraph and railroads, every city kept its own local time based on the sun. Noon was when the sun was highest in the sky, which varied by several minutes from one city to another, even 100 miles away. This worked fine when travel was slow and communications slower, but it created chaos for railroad scheduling and telegraph coordination.
In the United States, before standardization, there were over 300 different local times. A railroad crossing the country had to publish timetables using dozens of different local times, and passengers had to constantly adjust their watches as they traveled. Telegraph operators faced similar confusion when coordinating messages across different time zones. The solution was the adoption of standard time zones in 1883, where the country was divided into 4 zones, each using a uniform time. Britain had adopted a similar system earlier, establishing Greenwich Mean Time as the standard. The adoption of standard time zones was controversial. Some people protested that it was unnatural, that railroad companies and telegraph companies were replacing God's time, the sun's time, with artificial clock time. Religious leaders argued that humans shouldn't tamper with time established by divine creation. But the practical benefits were overwhelming, and within a few years, standard time zones were adopted internationally. The culture of telegraph operators was distinct and fascinating. Telegraph work required significant skill. Operators needed to master Morse code both for sending and receiving, develop the manual dexterity to key rapidly and accurately, and often needed some technical knowledge to maintain equipment. Good operators were in high demand and could command respectable salaries. The work had an aura of modernity and technical sophistication that attracted young people, and it was one of the first technical professions open to women in significant numbers. Telegraph operators developed their own culture and community. They communicated with each other over the wires during slow periods, developing friendships with operators in distant cities they might never meet in person. They created slang and jargon. A novice operator was a plug until they proved their competence. A highly skilled operator had a good fist, and operators identified each other by the characteristic rhythm and style of their keying. Some operators became famous within the community for their speed and accuracy, with informal competitions to see who could send and receive fastest. The work could be tedious and stressful. Operators sat for hours transcribing messages, maintaining concentration to avoid errors. A mistake could have serious consequences. A misplaced decimal in a financial order could cost thousands of dollars. An error in a military telegram could lead to strategic mistakes. A mistake in a personal telegram could cause unnecessary alarm or grief. The responsibility weighed on operators, and the best ones took pride in their accuracy and reliability.
Women entered telegraphy in substantial numbers starting in the 1850s and 1860s. Telegraph companies found that women made excellent operators. They had the manual dexterity, the patience, and the attention to detail the work required. Telegraphy offered women respectable employment at better wages than most other jobs available to them, and it required intelligence rather than physical strength. By the 1870s, women comprised a significant portion of telegraph operators, particularly in cities. The presence of women in telegraph offices was not without controversy. Some questioned whether it was appropriate for young women to work in public spaces, exposed to messages that might contain indelicate content. Others worried about women working alongside men in close quarters, but the practical benefits and the performance of female operators overcame most objections, and telegraphy became one of the first technical fields where women established a significant presence. Thomas Edison began his career as a telegraph operator in the 1860s, working night shifts and using slow periods to experiment with improvements to telegraph technology. His experience as an operator gave him intimate knowledge of the technology's limitations and opportunities, which he later used to develop innovations, including improved telegraph systems, the stock ticker, and eventually the phonograph and electric lighting. Edison's path from telegraph operator to famous inventor was unusual, but demonstrated that telegraphy could be a stepping stone to technical careers. The telegraph created new forms of crime and new law enforcement challenges. Criminals could use the telegraph to coordinate activities across distances. A bank robber could have an accomplice telegraph ahead to arrange escape routes or to warn of police movements. Confidence men could perpetrate frauds by telegraph, misrepresenting themselves or their offers to victims in distant cities who had no way to verify claims. Telegraph fraud became common enough to prompt legal responses. Some criminals would send fraudulent market information to investors, convincing them to buy or sell stocks based on false telegraphed reports.
Others would intercept telegrams to learn confidential business information that they could exploit. Still others would bribe telegraph operators to delay or alter competitors' telegrams, or to provide advance warning of incoming information. But the telegraph also aided law enforcement. Police could telegraph descriptions of criminals to other cities, allowing wanted individuals to be arrested far from where they committed crimes. Detectives could coordinate investigations across jurisdictions by telegraph. When major crimes occurred, descriptions of suspects could be telegraphed nationwide within hours, creating an early version of what would later become the FBI's most wanted lists. The telegraph created new forms of crime and new law enforcement challenges. Criminals could use the telegraph to coordinate activities across distances. A bank robber could have an accomplice telegraph ahead to arrange escape routes or to warn of police movements. Confidence men could perpetrate frauds by telegraph, misrepresenting themselves or their offers to victims in distant cities who had no way to verify claims. Telegraph fraud became common enough to prompt legal responses. Some criminals would send fraudulent market information to investors, convincing them to buy or sell stocks based on false telegraphed reports. Others would intercept telegrams to learn confidential business information that they could exploit. Still others would bribe telegraph operators to delay or alter competitors' telegrams, or to provide advance warning of incoming information. But the telegraph also aided law enforcement. Police could telegraph descriptions of criminals to other cities, allowing wanted individuals to be arrested far from where they committed crimes. Detectives could coordinate investigations across jurisdictions by telegraph. When major crimes occurred, descriptions of suspects could be telegraphed nationwide within hours, creating an early version of what would later become the FBI's most wanted lists. The telegraph enabled corporations to grow to unprecedented size by allowing central management to coordinate operations across vast distances. Before the telegraph, businesses were necessarily local or at most regional because owners couldn't effectively manage operations they couldn't easily visit and couldn't rapidly communicate with. The telegraph made national and eventually international corporations possible by providing the communication infrastructure necessary for coordination and control. Railroad companies were among the first to become large national corporations, enabled by telegraph communication that allowed them to manage operations across thousands of miles of track. Oil companies, steel companies, and other industrial enterprises followed, using telegraph networks to coordinate production, shipping, and sales across multiple facilities in different regions. By the late 19th century, corporations with tens of thousands of employees operating in dozens of cities were common, a scale of organization that would have been impossible without the telegraph. This corporate growth had significant social consequences. It concentrated economic power in fewer hands, as large corporations could outcompete smaller local businesses that lacked telegraph-enabled coordination. It created new management hierarchies, with layers of managers using the telegraph to transmit instructions downward and reports upward. It changed the nature of work for many people, who found themselves employees of distant corporations rather than workers for local owners they knew personally. The telegraph also changed language and writing styles, beyond just the compressed telegraph style. The expectation of rapid communication influenced all business writing, making it more concise and direct. The long, elaborate business letters of the early 19th century gave way to shorter, more focused communications, even in non-telegraph contexts. Some commentators worried that the telegraph was degrading language, encouraging sloppy abbreviation and the abandonment of proper grammar and style. Personal telegraphy existed, but was expensive and thus reserved for urgent matters. People would telegraph family members about births, deaths, serious illnesses, or emergencies, situations where the cost was justified by the urgency. The arrival of a telegram at someone's home often caused alarm because telegrams usually meant bad news, or at least important news. The Western Union delivery boy on his bicycle became a familiar but often unwelcome sight in neighborhoods. Romance occasionally flourished over the telegraph wires. Telegraph operators who communicated regularly over the wires sometimes developed affections despite never meeting in person. There are documented cases of telegraph operators who courted by telegraph, eventually meeting and marrying based on relationships that began as professional communications but evolved into something more personal. These telegraph romances were unusual, but captured public imagination as examples of how the new technology could create connections between strangers separated by distance. The telegraph created new anxieties that sound remarkably familiar to those we experience with modern communication technologies. People worried about information overload, too many messages arriving too quickly, demanding attention and responses without adequate time for reflection. Businessmen complained about the stress of constant connectivity, the inability to escape from work communications, the pressure to respond instantly to every telegram. Social critics worried that the telegraph was making society too fast-paced, that the contemplative pace of earlier eras was being lost to frenetic activity driven by instant communication. They argued that decisions were being made too quickly, without adequate thought, that the telegraph encouraged superficial thinking and impulsive action. Some worried that face-to-face communication was being replaced by impersonal telegram messages, that relationships were being degraded by the medium's limitations.
These anxieties intensified as telegraph use expanded and became more routine. The 1880s and 1890s saw growing concern about neurasthenia, nervous exhaustion supposedly caused by the pace of modern life, including constant telegraph communications. Doctors prescribed rest cures for businessmen suffering from the stress of too many telegrams demanding immediate attention. The telegraph was blamed for a general speeding up of life that some found exciting but others found overwhelming. Yet, despite these anxieties, people adapted to the telegraph and integrated it into their lives. What seemed overwhelming at first became routine with familiarity. The generation that grew up with the telegraph took its capabilities for granted, using it naturally without the sense of revolutionary change that their parents had experienced. By the 1890s, the telegraph was no longer a marvel, but a utility, its extraordinary achievement in shrinking the world having become invisible through familiarity. The cultural impact of the telegraph extended to literature and popular culture. Telegraph operators appeared in characters in novels and stories, often portrayed as modern, technically skilled individuals living on the cutting edge of progress. Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, published in 1873, featured the telegraph as a crucial technology that made the protagonist's journey possible. He could telegraph ahead to arrange transportation and funds, and his progress could be tracked by telegraph messages sent to newspapers. The telegraph appeared in poetry and art as a symbol of modernity, progress, and the shrinking of distance. Some artists celebrated it as a triumph of human ingenuity, while others viewed it with ambivalence or concern as a force changing society in unsettling ways. The image of telegraph wires stretching across landscapes became iconic, representing the connection of the modern world and the overlay of technology onto nature. Telegraph companies became major corporations, wielding significant economic and political power. Western Union, which consolidated control of most American telegraph service by the 1870s, was one of the largest corporations in the country. Its stock was traded heavily, its management was courted by politicians, and its policies affected millions of users. Similar dominant telegraph companies emerged in other countries, and their power raised concerns about monopoly and the control of essential communications infrastructure. Regulation of telegraph companies became a political issue. Should telegraph service be treated as a utility subject to government regulation? Should rates be controlled? Should telegraph companies be prevented from discriminating in service or pricing? Should the government own and operate telegraph lines as it did the postal system in many countries? These questions were debated extensively in the late 19th century, with different nations reaching different conclusions based on their political philosophies and economic systems. In the United States, telegraph companies remained private enterprises subject to some regulation, though Western Union's near monopoly raised periodic concerns. In Britain, the telegraph was nationalized in 1870, with the post office taking over private telegraph companies and operating telegraph service as a government monopoly.
Many European nations followed similar paths, integrating telegraph service with postal service under government control. These different approaches reflected different views about the role of government in providing essential services. The technical evolution of telegraphy continued through the late 19th century, even as the basic principles remained unchanged. Duplex systems that could send messages in both directions simultaneously over a single wire doubled capacity without requiring additional cables. Quadruplex systems, perfected by Edison and others, could send 4 messages simultaneously, 2 in each direction, over a single wire, further multiplying capacity. Automatic telegraph systems that could send and receive at higher speeds than human operators were developed, though they never fully replaced skilled operators for complex messages. The printing telegraph, which could transmit text that was automatically printed at the receiving end without requiring operators to transcribe Morse code, was developed in various forms. These machines used keyboards like typewriters and printed incoming messages directly, making telegraph communication accessible to people who hadn't learned Morse code. The printing telegraph was particularly useful for businesses that sent many messages and preferred the convenience of direct printing. Despite these innovations, the fundamental telegraph technology remained largely unchanged from the 1840s through the early 20th century. Electrical pulses representing dots and dashes, transmitted through wires and decoded by operators or machines. The system worked reliably, and incremental improvements made it faster and more efficient, but no revolutionary change in the technology occurred until wireless telegraphy and then telephony began to compete with and eventually supersede the wire telegraph. By the 1890s, the telegraph had been integrated into society so thoroughly that it was difficult to imagine the world without it. Businesses relied on it for essential communications. Newspapers depended on it for news. Governments used it for diplomatic and administrative coordination. Railroads needed it for safe operations. Financial markets were built around it. The telegraph had become infrastructure, as essential and as invisible as roads or water systems, noticed mainly when it failed.
Yet even as the telegraph reached its maturity as a technology and a social system, new communication technologies were emerging that would eventually supplement and then replace it. The telephone, invented in 1876, initially seemed like a curiosity with limited application. Why would you need to speak to someone at a distance when you could send a telegram? But the telephone offered something the telegraph couldn't: direct voice communication without requiring operators or knowledge of codes. By the 1890s, telephone networks were expanding rapidly in cities, offering an alternative to telegraph for some communications. Wireless telegraphy, developed by Marconi and others in the 1890s, promised to send telegraph signals without wires, using electromagnetic waves to carry information through the air. This seemed like magic, communication without the enormous investment in wires and cables that the telegraph required. Wireless telegraphy would prove crucial for ship-to-shore communication and eventually evolve into radio broadcasting, but in the 1890s it was still experimental and limited in range and reliability. The telegraph's dominance of long-distance communication would continue into the early 20th century, but the seeds of its eventual decline had been planted. The telephone would gradually take over short and medium-distance communication where voice was valuable. Wireless telegraphy and then radio would provide communication without the constraints of wires. Eventually, newer technologies would make the wire telegraph obsolete, relegating it to history as the first but not the final solution to instant long-distance communication.
We have explored the Victorian Internet, the world transformed by telegraph wires carrying coded messages at the speed of electricity. We have seen how the telegraph changed business by collapsing the time required for commercial communication, how it transformed journalism by making news immediate rather than delayed, how it enabled corporations to grow to unprecedented scale, how it created new anxieties about pace and information overload that echo our own experiences with modern technology. The telegraph had become, by the late 19th century, essential infrastructure that shaped how society functioned. It was the nervous system of the modern world, carrying information that coordinated commerce, reported news, enabled government, and occasionally connected individuals across distances that had once meant isolation. The world had shrunk, not physically, but communicatively. Distance still existed, but it no longer determined how quickly information could travel. But the telegraph was not just infrastructure enabling routine communication. It was also a technology that played crucial roles in specific historical events, that influenced the outcomes of wars and diplomatic crises, that enabled both great achievements and terrible tragedies. In our next chapter, we will explore these specific historical moments, where the telegraph made a decisive difference, where dots and dashes traveling through wires changed the course of history. We will witness the telegraph's role in the American Civil War, where it gave Union forces a crucial advantage in coordinating armies across vast distances. We will see how it shaped the diplomacy leading to World War I and how it was used during that conflict. We will explore how it enabled the coordination of relief efforts during disasters and how it sometimes spread panic as well as information. We will see the telegraph at its most consequential, in moments where the ability to communicate instantly shaped events in ways that would have been impossible in the slow world that existed before. The infrastructure we have explored was not neutral. It was used by humans for human purposes, sometimes noble, sometimes terrible, always consequential. The telegraph changed what was possible, and in changing possibility, it changed history. Rest now, and when you're ready, we will explore those moments when dots and dashes carried messages that changed the world.
In our journey through the telegraph revolution, we have witnessed the invention of electrical communication, the extraordinary engineering feat of submarine cables connecting continents, and the transformation of Victorian society as instant communication became routine. We have explored the telegraph as infrastructure, as technology, as business, as a system that shrank the world and changed how people lived and worked. But now imagine a different scene. It is the spring of 1862, and President Abraham Lincoln sits in the War Department telegraph office in Washington, reading messages that have just arrived over the wire from battlefields hundreds of miles away. These are not routine business communications or newspaper dispatches. These are reports from generals commanding armies, describing victories and defeats, requesting reinforcements or supplies, reporting casualties and positions. Lincoln reads them as they arrive, sometimes within minutes of being sent, and drafts replies that will reach those generals while battles are still unfolding. This is something no president, no military commander, no political leader in all of human history had been able to do before: to follow military campaigns in near real time, to adjust strategy based on current information, to coordinate multiple armies across vast distances with hours rather than weeks of delay. The telegraph had not just changed commerce and journalism, it had changed warfare, diplomacy, and the very nature of command and control in conflict and crisis. This is the story of specific moments when the telegraph made history, when dots and dashes traveling through copper wires carried messages that shaped the outcomes of wars, triggered diplomatic crises, coordinated responses to disasters, and occasionally prevented catastrophes through timely warnings. These are the moments when the telegraph's impact was not gradual and systemic, but immediate and decisive, when we can point to specific telegrams and say, that message changed what happened. That communication altered the course of events. Those dots and dashes made a difference in ways that still echo through history. The American Civil War, which began in April 1861 and ended in April 1865, was the first major conflict in which the telegraph played a central and decisive role. When the war began, the United States had approximately 50,000 miles of telegraph lines connecting every major city and many smaller towns. The Confederacy controlled a substantial portion of these lines in the South, but the Union had more extensive infrastructure in the North and better access to equipment and trained operators. This telegraph infrastructure would prove to be one of the Union's most significant strategic advantages. Abraham Lincoln was perhaps the first political leader to fully grasp the telegraph's military potential.
Unlike many of his generals, who were trained in pre-telegraph warfare and sometimes viewed the new technology with suspicion, Lincoln immediately recognized that the telegraph allowed him to function as a commander-in-chief in ways no previous president could have imagined. He could communicate directly with field commanders, bypassing the traditional chain of command when necessary, and he could coordinate multiple armies operating in different theaters of the war. The War Department Telegraph Office in Washington became Lincoln's command center. He visited it frequently, sometimes several times a day, reading incoming messages and drafting replies. The telegraph operators there came to know him well, observing that he would often sit quietly, reading telegrams, his face showing the weight of the information they contained. Casualty reports, news of defeats, requests for reinforcements that couldn't be provided. The operators remembered that he would often draft messages in careful longhand, revising them multiple times before having them sent, understanding that his words would reach field commanders within hours and might influence battles currently being fought. The Union's Military Telegraph Corps was established in 1861, eventually employing over 1,200 operators who strung lines, operated equipment, and managed communications for the Army. These civilian operators, not subject to military discipline, but working under Army authority, became essential to Union military operations. They strung telegraph wire alongside advancing armies, sometimes under fire, establishing communication as quickly as territory was captured. They operated mobile telegraph units that could be set up rapidly to provide field communications. They encrypted messages to prevent Confederate interception, using cipher systems that grew increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. The Confederate forces also used telegraph extensively, but faced greater challenges. The South had fewer trained operators, less manufacturing capacity for wire and equipment, and saw much of its telegraph infrastructure destroyed as Union forces advanced. The Confederacy struggled to maintain and expand its telegraph network throughout the war, though Confederate operators showed great ingenuity in keeping systems operating despite shortages of materials.
One of the telegraph's most significant impacts was in coordinating troop movements and logistics. Railroads were crucial for moving troops and supplies rapidly, and the telegraph was essential for managing railroad operations safely and efficiently. Union forces could telegraph instructions to transport troops from one theater to another, coordinate supply shipments, and ensure that reinforcements arrived where needed. The ability to move large forces by rail and coordinate those movements by telegraph gave Union commanders flexibility that Confederate forces, with their more limited infrastructure, couldn't match. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 illustrated the telegraph's military value. Union General George McClellan received intelligence about Confederate General Robert E. Lee's plans through a captured dispatch and was able to telegraph this information to Washington while also coordinating the movement of his forces. Lincoln followed the battle through telegrams from the field, receiving updates on the fighting as it progressed. After the battle, which stopped Lee's invasion of the North, Lincoln was able to telegraph his Emancipation Proclamation announcement shortly afterward, using the telegraph to ensure the proclamation reached the entire nation quickly. The telegraph also changed military intelligence and counterintelligence. Both sides attempted to intercept and decode enemy telegrams with varying degrees of success. Telegraph lines could be tapped by physically attaching wires to existing lines, allowing operators to listen to enemy communications. Countermeasures included frequently changing cipher codes, sending false information over wires known to be compromised, and using trusted couriers for the most sensitive communications, rather than risking telegraph transmission. Generals had mixed reactions to telegraph communications from political leaders. Some appreciated the ability to receive guidance and request support. Others chafed at what they saw as interference from civilian authorities who didn't understand battlefield realities. The tension between political control enabled by the telegraph and military autonomy traditionally enjoyed by field commanders became a recurring theme in Civil War command relationships. Lincoln generally used the telegraph judiciously, offering guidance rather than micromanaging, but the very existence of instant communication changed the relationship between political leadership and military command in fundamental ways. The telegraph also had psychological impacts on both leaders and the public.
News of battles reached cities within hours rather than days, meaning that families learned of victories or defeats, and often of casualty lists, much more quickly than in previous wars. This immediacy intensified both the joy of victories and the grief of losses. The telegraph made the war more present in daily life, even for those far from battlefields, as newspapers published telegraphed reports that brought the conflict into homes across the nation. When General Ulysses S. Grant accepted General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the news reached Washington by telegraph within hours. The city erupted in celebration that same day, with crowds gathering to celebrate the end of the war. Just 5 days later, on April 14th, telegraph wires carried the shocking news that President Lincoln had been shot at Ford's Theater. The nation learned of his death on April 15th through telegrams that spread the news across the country within a day. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, fled into Maryland and Virginia, and telegraphed descriptions of him reached law enforcement across the region, though he managed to evade capture for 12 days before being cornered and killed. The Civil War demonstrated conclusively that the telegraph had become a decisive military technology. Future conflicts would be fought with the assumption that commanders could communicate rapidly with their forces and with political leadership, that intelligence could be transmitted and acted upon quickly, and that public knowledge of military events would be nearly instantaneous. The telegraph had changed warfare permanently, making it faster-paced, more coordinated, and more subject to political oversight than ever before. International diplomacy was similarly transformed by the telegraph, though the changes were more subtle and sometimes more dangerous. Before the telegraph, diplomacy had moved at a leisurely pace determined by the time required for messages to travel between capitals. Ambassadors enjoyed substantial autonomy because waiting weeks or months for instructions was impractical. Crises developed slowly, giving diplomats time to craft careful responses and for cooler heads to prevail.
The telegraph changed this dynamic by allowing foreign ministries to maintain much tighter control over their ambassadors and by enabling rapid exchanges between governments that could escalate crises before diplomatic mechanisms could diffuse them. Some historians argue that this acceleration of diplomatic communication contributed to international tensions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as governments could exchange heated messages rapidly without the cooling-off period that slow communication had previously enforced. The Trent Affair in 1861 illustrated both the telegraph's diplomatic value and its limitations. Confederate envoys James Mason and John Slidell were traveling to Europe aboard the British ship RMS Trent when the USS San Jacinto, a Union warship, stopped the British ship and forcibly removed the Confederate diplomats. Britain was outraged at this violation of neutral shipping rights, and there was serious talk of war between Britain and the United States at a time when the Union could ill afford another enemy. News of the incident traveled by ship to Britain, taking about 2 weeks, so the crisis developed more slowly than it would have with a functioning Atlantic cable. This delay, paradoxically, may have been beneficial, as it gave both sides time to consider their positions before responding. The 1858 Atlantic cable had failed by this point, and the permanent cable wouldn't be completed until 1866, so transatlantic communication was still limited to ships. By the time British outrage reached Washington and American responses returned to London, several weeks had passed, allowing diplomatic efforts to find a face-saving resolution. The crisis was resolved peacefully, with the Union releasing the Confederate envoys while maintaining that the principle of stopping ships carrying contraband was valid. Some historians have speculated that if a working Atlantic cable had existed during the Trent Affair, allowing instant communication and rapid exchanges of heated messages, the crisis might have escalated into war before cooler heads could prevail. The telegraph's speed wasn't always an advantage in diplomacy, where time for reflection and careful response sometimes prevented conflicts. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 was the first major European conflict where both sides had extensive telegraph networks. Prussia used the telegraph to coordinate its armies with unprecedented precision, contributing to its swift and decisive victories over France.
Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor, famously manipulated telegraph communications during the war's preliminary diplomatic phase, editing the Ems dispatch, a telegram reporting on a meeting between the Prussian king and the French ambassador, to make it seem more insulting than it actually was, then releasing the edited version to the press. The resulting outrage in both France and Prussia helped trigger the war Bismarck wanted, demonstrating how telegraph communications could be weaponized for political purposes. During the war itself, when the Prussian army besieged Paris, the French used creative methods to maintain communication with the outside world despite the siege. Balloons carried messages and people out of the city, flying over Prussian lines. The messages were then telegraphed from safer locations to their destinations. This combination of balloon and telegraph communication allowed the French government to maintain some contact with unoccupied territories, though it wasn't sufficient to change the war's outcome. The telegraph played crucial roles in various imperial conflicts and colonial administration during the late 19th century. The British Empire, in particular, relied on the telegraph for managing its far-flung territories. The completion of telegraph links to India in the 1960s and 1970s transformed British rule there. The Viceroy in India could now communicate with London in hours rather than months, receiving instructions and reporting on developments with unprecedented speed. This rapid communication was a double-edged sword for colonial officials. On one hand, they could request support, report crises, and coordinate with the home government far more effectively than when communication took months. On the other hand, they lost much of the autonomy they previously enjoyed, as London could now second-guess decisions and issue detailed instructions on matters that previously would have been left to local judgment. The telegraph also enabled imperial powers to coordinate military operations across vast distances. During colonial conflicts and native uprisings, European powers could rapidly move troops, coordinate naval and land forces, and respond to crises with a speed that gave them significant advantages over opponents who lacked similar communications infrastructure. The Zulu Wars in South Africa, various campaigns in India, and colonial operations across Africa all saw telegraph communications playing important roles in European military success. The Spanish-American War of 1898 demonstrated the telegraph's influence not just on military operations, but on public opinion and politics. American newspapers used the telegraph to file sensational reports about Spanish rule in Cuba, helping to inflame American public opinion and create pressure for intervention. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898 was reported by telegraph to American newspapers within hours, and the news created an immediate sensation that pushed the nation toward war.
During the brief conflict, the U.S. Navy's first action was to cut the telegraph cables connecting Cuba to Spain, isolating Spanish forces from communication with their government. This gave American forces a significant information advantage. They could coordinate their operations by telegraph, while Spanish forces in Cuba were cut off from instructions. The war lasted only a few months, but the telegraph played a role in both causing it through sensationalized reporting and in determining its outcome through the denial of communications to Spanish forces. The Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900 illustrated the telegraph's role in international crisis response. When Chinese nationalist forces besieged foreign legations in Beijing, cutting telegraph lines to the city, the world feared that all foreigners there had been killed. The lack of telegraph communication created uncertainty and panic, with rumors and speculation filling the void. When telegraph contact was eventually restored, and it was learned that the legation still held out, an international relief expedition was organized and coordinated by telegraph, bringing together forces from 8 different nations. The ability to coordinate this multinational military operation across thousands of miles would have been impossible without the telegraph. Disasters and their aftermaths were profoundly affected by the telegraph. Before the telegraph, communities experiencing disasters, earthquakes, floods, fires, epidemics, had to rely on whatever local resources they could muster, with help from distant places arriving only after news of the disaster traveled by conventional means, which could take days or weeks. The telegraph allowed immediate reporting of disasters and rapid coordination of relief efforts, potentially saving thousands of lives.
The Johnstown flood of 1889 in Pennsylvania illustrated both the telegraph's value and its limitations in disaster response. When a dam failed and sent a wall of water through the city, killing over 2,200 people, telegraph lines were among the infrastructure destroyed. This initially prevented news of the disaster from reaching the outside world quickly. But once some telegraph communication was restored, news of the catastrophe spread across the nation within hours, and relief efforts could be organized immediately. Donations, supplies, and rescue workers began arriving within days, far faster than would have been possible without the telegraph to spread the news and coordinate the response. The Galveston hurricane of 1900, one of the deadliest natural disasters in American history, saw telegraph communication playing a crucial role. The hurricane destroyed the city's telegraph connections, leaving Galveston isolated for a day. When communication was restored and the scale of the disaster, over 6,000 dead, became known, the telegraph enabled a rapid relief response. President McKinley learned of the disaster by telegraph and immediately ordered federal assistance. Donations poured in from across the country, coordinated by telegraph messages arranging shipments of supplies, medical personnel, and funds. The telegraph also enabled warnings of approaching disasters, sometimes allowing people to prepare or evacuate. Weather bureaus in various countries began using telegraph networks to collect meteorological data from multiple locations and to distribute weather forecasts and storm warnings. The U.S. Weather Bureau, established in 1870, relied heavily on telegraph communications to gather weather reports from across the country and to disseminate warnings of severe weather. While forecasting technology was primitive by modern standards, the telegraph at least allowed warnings to reach threatened areas before storms arrived, providing some opportunity for preparation. Maritime disasters gained new dimensions with the telegraph. When ships sank or experienced emergencies near shore, coastal telegraph stations could relay distress calls, summon rescue ships, and notify families far faster than previously possible. The telegraph couldn't help ships at sea out of sight of land, which would require wireless telegraphy, which emerged later, but for ships near coasts served by telegraph cables, the ability to summon help rapidly was valuable. Financial panic spread more rapidly because of the telegraph, but also potentially could be managed more effectively. The Panic of 1873, a severe economic crisis that began with bank failures in Vienna and spread across Europe and America, demonstrated how telegraph communications could transmit financial contagion rapidly. As news of bank failures in one city reached other cities by telegraph, depositors would rush to withdraw their money from local banks, triggering failures that might have been avoided with slower communication. Yet the telegraph also enabled coordination of responses to financial crises. Central banks and government treasuries could communicate rapidly about interventions, coordinate monetary policy, and arrange transfers of funds to shore up threatened institutions. The speed that spread panic could also spread stabilizing responses, though whether the net effect was stabilizing or destabilizing remained debated among economists and financial authorities. Criminal activity and law enforcement were both affected by the telegraph. Criminals could use telegraph communications to coordinate illegal activities, to warn accomplices of police movements, or to perpetrate frauds at a distance. But law enforcement gained even more significant advantages. Police departments in different cities could communicate about crimes and suspects, sharing descriptions and coordinating investigations in ways never before possible. The telegraph enabled the creation of national and eventually international law enforcement networks. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, established in the 1850s, used telegraph communications extensively to coordinate investigations across multiple states, track criminals who fled across state lines, and share intelligence about criminal activities. Local police forces increasingly shared information by telegraph, creating informal networks that would eventually formalize into more organized systems. One famous case that demonstrated the telegraph's value in law enforcement was the capture of Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen in 1910. Crippen had murdered his wife in London and fled to Canada aboard a ship with his mistress, both disguised. The ship's captain became suspicious and upon reaching Canadian waters sent a wireless telegraph message to Scotland Yard. This was one of the first uses of wireless telegraphy in criminal investigation. Police telegraphed ahead to Canadian authorities who arrested Crippen when he disembarked, making him one of the first criminals caught by wireless telegraph communication. Political events and assassinations were reported by telegraph with an immediacy that shocked contemporaries. When President James Garfield was shot in July 1881, telegraph wires spread the news across America within hours. For the 11 weeks that Garfield lingered before dying of his wounds, the nation followed his condition through telegraphed medical bulletins issued daily and sometimes more frequently. When he finally died in September 1881, the Telegraph immediately carried the news, and his vice president, Chester Arthur, learned he was now president through a telegram delivered in the middle of the night. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II of Russia in 1881 and Empress Elizabeth of Austria in 1898 were similarly reported across the world by telegraph within hours of occurring, creating international sensation and, in some cases, diplomatic complications. The telegraph made major political events into immediate global news rather than information that would filter out slowly over days and weeks. Elections and their results were transformed by telegraph reporting. Before the telegraph, election results from distant regions might take days or weeks to reach the capital and be tabulated. The telegraph allowed near real-time reporting of results from across the country, so that by the evening of election day, preliminary results were often known. This changed political culture, creating the election night tradition, where supporters gathered to hear telegraphed results as they came in, rather than waiting days or weeks to learn outcomes. Presidential election night in the United States became a major news event because of the telegraph. Newspapers would receive telegraphed results from across the country and post them in windows for crowds gathered outside. By midnight or the early hours of the morning, the outcome was usually clear, even though official certification would take much longer. This immediacy changed political strategy, as candidates and parties could no longer depend on time to spin narratives about election results. The results were known too quickly for much spinning to be effective. The telegraph's role in the lead-up to World War I was complex and controversial. In the weeks following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914, telegraph communications between European capitals carried the diplomatic exchanges that failed to prevent war and possibly contributed to the crisis spiraling out of control. The various European powers exchanged ultimatums, mobilization orders, and diplomatic notes by telegraph during July 1914. The speed of these communications meant that crises escalated rapidly without much time for reflection or for diplomatic efforts to find compromises. Some historians argue that if communication had been slower, as it would have been before the telegraph, there might have been more time for cooler heads to prevail and for the mechanisms of diplomacy to find ways to de-escalate tensions. The July crisis of 1914 saw telegrams flying between Berlin, Vienna, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London almost constantly. Monarchs telegraphed each other. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who were cousins, exchanged telegrams trying to prevent war even as their governments were preparing for it. These willy-nicky telegrams, as historians call them, show leaders trying to use personal relationships and direct communication to prevent catastrophe. But they failed because broader forces and the momentum of mobilization plans overtook individual efforts. Once the war began in August 1914, the telegraph became crucial infrastructure for both sides. One of the first acts of the conflict was Britain severing the German telegraph cables, cutting Germany off from direct telegraph communication with the outside world. This forced Germany to route communications through neutral countries or to use wireless telegraphy, both of which were vulnerable to interception.
Britain's control of most undersea telegraph cables gave it an enormous intelligence advantage, as British intelligence could read much of Germany's diplomatic and military communications. The famous Zimmermann telegram of January 1917 was a German diplomatic message sent by telegraph through various routes trying to avoid British interception. In it, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann proposed an alliance with Mexico, offering to help Mexico recover territories lost to the United States in the 19th century if Mexico would join Germany in war against America. British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram, and its revelation to the American public helped push the United States into World War I on the Allied side. The Zimmermann telegram illustrated several important points about telegraph communications in wartime. First, even encrypted telegrams could be intercepted and decoded with sufficient effort and expertise. British code breakers at Room 40 had become highly skilled at breaking German codes. Second, control of telegraph cables gave enormous intelligence advantages, as Britain's dominance of undersea telegraphs meant they could intercept most telegrams they wished to. Third, telegraph communications could have decisive political impacts. The revelation of the Zimmermann telegram significantly shifted American public opinion towards supporting war against Germany. During the war itself, telegraph communications were essential for coordinating the massive military operations. The Western Front, stretching hundreds of miles from the English Channel to Switzerland, required constant communication to coordinate attacks, manage logistics, and respond to enemy actions. Armies laid thousands of miles of telegraph wire connecting headquarters to frontline units. When wire was cut by artillery bombardment, it had to be repaired quickly, sometimes under fire, to restore communications.
The stalemate of trench warfare was partly a result of telegraph-enabled coordination, allowing defenders to move reserves rapidly to threatened points. When an attack was detected, telegraph messages could summon reinforcements from quiet sectors faster than the attacking forces could exploit any breakthrough. The telegraph made defense easier than offense in some respects, contributing to the deadlock that characterized much of the war. Naval operations in World War I relied heavily on telegraph and wireless communications. The British Royal Navy could coordinate operations across vast distances using telegraph cables and wireless sets. The convoy system, developed to protect merchant shipping from submarine attacks, required sophisticated communication and coordination that would have been impossible without the telegraph. Ships in convoys communicated with escorts using wireless, while escorts coordinated with shore stations using both wireless and cable communications. The human cost of the war was brought home to families with terrible immediacy by the telegraph. War Office telegrams informing families that their sons, husbands, or fathers had been killed, wounded, or were missing became dreaded communications. The arrival of a telegram delivery boy in a neighborhood during the war years often meant tragedy for some family, and the sight could cause anxiety for everyone. The telegraph's speed meant families learned of losses within days rather than weeks, but this immediacy brought grief faster without necessarily making it easier to bear. The armistice that ended fighting on November 11, 1918, was communicated by telegraph to all fronts, with the agreed-upon time of 11 a.m. allowing coordinated cessation of fighting. News of the armistice spread by telegraph around the world within hours, triggering celebrations in Allied countries and despair in Germany. The telegraph had helped cause the war, had been crucial to fighting it, and now announced its end. Looking back on the period from the 1860s to the end of World War I, the telegraph's influence on specific historical events was profound. It had changed warfare by enabling rapid coordination of forces across vast distances. It had transformed diplomacy by accelerating communication between governments, sometimes helpfully and sometimes dangerously. It had enabled more effective responses to disasters and crises. It had aided law enforcement while also creating new opportunities for crime. It had made political events into immediate news rather than delayed information. Yet for all these specific impacts, perhaps the telegraph's most profound effect was psychological and cultural. It had created expectations of immediacy, of rapid responses, of staying informed about distant events as they unfolded. The slow world that had existed for all of previous human history was gone, replaced by a world where distance was no longer a barrier to communication, where events anywhere could be known everywhere within hours, where the pace of life and politics and commerce had accelerated beyond what previous generations could have imagined. The dots and dashes that traveled through telegraph wires had carried mundane business messages and casual personal notes, but they had also carried declarations of war and announcements of peace, reports of disasters and coordinations of relief, news of victories and lists of the dead, diplomatic threats and last-minute attempts to prevent catastrophe. The telegraph had become woven into the fabric of history itself, a technology so essential that major events were shaped by its existence and by the instant communication it enabled.
We have traced the telegraph's influence through specific historical moments, watching as dots and dashes traveling through copper wires carried messages that changed the course of wars, influenced diplomatic crises, coordinated responses to disasters, and brought news of triumph and tragedy to millions with unprecedented speed. We have seen the telegraph at its most consequential in those moments where instant communication made a tangible difference in what happened and how events unfolded. But even as the telegraph reached its peak of importance in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, even as it became essential infrastructure that shaped how the modern world functioned, new communication technologies were emerging that would eventually supplement and then supplant it. The telephone, which allowed voice communication without operators or codes, was expanding rapidly. Wireless telegraphy, which could send messages without wires, was developing from novelty to necessity, particularly for maritime communications. Radio broadcasting was beginning to emerge, promising to send information not just from point to point, but from one point to many simultaneously. The telegraph's dominance of long-distance communication would continue for several more decades after World War I, but its eventual decline was inevitable. Newer technologies could do everything the telegraph could do and more, often more conveniently and at lower cost. The telegraph would gradually become obsolete, its wires taken down, its offices closed, its operators retrained for newer technologies, or retired as relics of an earlier era. Yet the telegraph's influence did not end with its technological obsolescence. The patterns of communication it established, the expectations it created, the social changes it triggered, all these would continue and intensify with the technologies that succeeded it. The telegraph was the first chapter in the story of instant communication, but that story would continue through the telephone, radio, television, and eventually the internet. Each new technology would build on what the telegraph had begun, shrinking the world further, accelerating communication more, creating new possibilities and new challenges. In our final chapter, we will explore the telegraph's legacy, how it influenced the technologies that replaced it, what lessons we can draw from the telegraph revolution for understanding our own digital revolution, and how the world the telegraph created continues to shape our lives, even though we no longer send messages in Morse code through copper wires. We will see that while the specific technology may be obsolete, the telegraph's impact on human society was permanent, creating a world that could never return to the slow pace of pre-telegraph communication. The telegraph era is ending, but its legacy is eternal. The world it shrank remains shrunk, the expectations it created remain with us, and the patterns it established continue to shape how we communicate today. Rest now, and when you're ready, we will explore the final chapter of the telegraph's story, its legacy, its lessons, and its enduring influence on the connected world we inhabit today.
We have traveled together through an extraordinary journey, from a world where messages moved at the speed of horses to one connected by copper wires carrying electrical pulses at nearly the speed of light.
We witnessed Samuel Morse's first experimental transmission, followed the heroic efforts to lay cables across ocean floors, explored how the telegraph transformed Victorian society, and saw how dots and dashes changed the course of history in wars, crises, and pivotal moments. Now imagine standing in a telegraph office in 1920, watching an operator tap out a message in Morse code, the sounder clicking rhythmically as replies arrive from distant cities. The office is busy, but no longer as frantic as it once was. Nearby, you notice something new, a telephone on the desk, its presence somehow diminishing the telegraph's centrality. On the wall, a radio receiver crackles with news broadcasts, information flowing through the air without wires. The telegraph still works, still serves essential functions, but the future is already arriving in forms that will eventually make it obsolete. This is the beginning of the end for the telegraph, though that ending would take decades to fully unfold. The technology that had revolutionized human communication, that had shrunk the world and changed society so profoundly, would gradually be replaced by newer technologies that could do everything the telegraph did and more. Yet even as the telegraph faded into history, its influence would persist in ways both obvious and subtle, shaping the communication technologies that succeeded it and establishing patterns that continue in our own digital age. This is the story of the telegraph's legacy, how it influenced the telephone, radio, and eventually the internet, what lessons it holds for understanding our own communication revolution, and how this 19th century technology permanently changed human society in ways we still experience every day, even though we no longer send messages in dots and dashes through copper wires. The telegraph's decline was gradual, measured not in years but in decades, as newer technologies slowly eroded its dominance of long-distance communication. In 1900, the telegraph was at its peak, an essential technology woven into the fabric of modern life, indispensable for business, journalism, government, and personal communication. By 1970, it was nearly extinct, a relic kept alive only for a few specialized purposes and for nostalgia. Understanding this transition helps us see both what the telegraph accomplished and why it ultimately couldn't compete with technologies that offered more convenient ways to communicate. The telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, seemed like a curiosity with limited commercial application. Early telephones had short range, poor sound quality, and required dedicated lines between locations that wanted to communicate. The telegraph, by contrast, was a mature technology with extensive infrastructure, skilled operators, and established business practices. When telephone service was first offered commercially in the late 1870s, most businessmen saw it as a novelty rather than a serious competitor to the telegraph. But the telephone had one overwhelming advantage that would eventually prove decisive. It allowed direct voice communication between people without requiring operators to translate messages into and out of code. With a telephone, you could speak directly to someone in another city, hearing their voice and having a real conversation with immediate back and forth. No need to compress your message into expensive telegraphic brevity. No need to go to a telegraph office or wait for a messenger to deliver a telegram. No need to trust your message to an operator who would read it while transcribing it. The telephone was private, immediate, and natural in a way the telegraph could never be. Initially, telephone networks were local, connecting subscribers within a city or town. Long-distance telephone service was technically challenging because voice signals degraded over distance far more rapidly than telegraph signals. The first telephone line from New York to Chicago, completed in 1892, was a major achievement, but the sound quality was poor and the service expensive. The telegraph retained its dominance in long-distance communication because it simply worked better over hundreds or thousands of miles than early telephone technology could.
The breakthrough that enabled long-distance telephony was the invention of electronic amplifiers in the early 20th century. Lee de Forest's Audion tube, invented in 1906, and later improvements, created the ability to amplify weak telephone signals, allowing clear voice communication across continental distances.
By the 1920s, telephone service was expanding rapidly for both local and long-distance communication, and the telegraph began losing market share. For personal communication and for business discussions requiring back-and-forth exchange, the telephone was clearly superior to the telegraph. You could call someone and have a conversation, discuss complex matters, ask questions and get immediate answers, all things that were awkward or impossible with telegrams. Telephone companies actively promoted long-distance calling as more personal and effective than telegrams, and people responded. The volume of telegrams began declining in the 1920s and 1930s as telephone service expanded and prices gradually decreased. Yet, the telegraph retained significant advantages for certain applications. Telegraph messages created written records, useful for legal and business purposes where documentation was important. Telegrams could be delivered to people who didn't have telephones, which in the early 20th century was still most people outside of cities. Multiple copies of the same telegram could be sent to multiple recipients efficiently, something that required separate telephone calls. And for very short messages, a simple confirmation, a brief notification, a telegram was often cheaper than a long-distance phone call. News services and financial markets continued using telegraph extensively through the mid-20th century because the infrastructure was in place, the systems were reliable, and the written record was valuable. The stock ticker, which was essentially a specialized telegraph device, remained central to financial markets until electronic displays replaced it in the 1960s. News agencies like Associated Press and Reuters transmitted stories by telegraph for decades after telephone service was widely available, only gradually transitioning to telephone and eventually electronic transmission. Wireless telegraphy, developed by Guglielmo Marconi and others in the 1890s and early 1900s, represented a different kind of competition for the wire telegraph. Wireless used electromagnetic waves, radio waves, to transmit telegraph signals through the air without requiring physical wires. This was revolutionary for maritime communication, where ships at sea had previously been completely isolated once they left sight of land. Wireless telegraphy allowed ships to communicate with shore stations and with each other, dramatically improving safety and enabling coordination of shipping. The first practical demonstration of wireless telegraphy's value came in April 1912, when the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg and began sinking in the North Atlantic. The ship's wireless operator sent distress calls, the famous SOS signal, transmitted in Morse code as ... that were received by several ships in the area. The RMS Carpathia, about 58 miles away, responded to the distress call and rescued over 700 survivors. Without wireless telegraphy, all 2,224 people aboard Titanic would likely have perished, as no one would have known of the disaster until the ship failed to arrive at its destination. The Titanic disaster led to international regulations requiring ships to maintain continuous wireless watch and to have sufficient lifeboats for all passengers and crew. It demonstrated that wireless communication had moved from novelty to necessity for maritime safety. Coastal wireless stations proliferated, and wireless telegraphy operators became essential crew members on ships. The romance of the wireless operator, sending and receiving messages in Morse code from a ship at sea, captured public imagination and attracted many young people to the profession. But even as wireless telegraphy was establishing itself, a new application of wireless technology was emerging that would eventually overshadow telegraphy entirely: wireless telephony, or radio broadcasting. In the early 1900s, experimenters discovered that voice and music could be transmitted by wireless along with Morse code signals. This evolved into radio broadcasting, where signals were transmitted not from one point to another, but from one point to many receivers simultaneously. Radio broadcasting emerged commercially in the 1920s, offering something entirely new: the ability to transmit entertainment, news, and information to unlimited audiences simultaneously. A radio station could broadcast to thousands or millions of listeners at once, something neither telegraphy nor telephony could do. Radio became a mass medium, democratizing access to information and entertainment in ways that transformed society as profoundly as the telegraph had 70 years earlier. For point-to-point communication, radio telephony, voice communication by wireless, gradually replaced wireless telegraphy in many applications. It was more convenient to speak directly by radio than to communicate in Morse code, just as the telephone had been more convenient than telegraph for wired communication. By the mid-20th century, ships, aircraft, and military forces increasingly used voice radio rather than wireless telegraphy, though Morse code remained important for long-distance communication under difficult conditions because it was more reliable when signals were weak or noisy. The telegraph companies themselves recognized that their core business was declining and attempted to adapt. Western Union, which had dominated American telegraphy since the late 19th century, diversified into money transfers, developing what became one of its most enduring businesses. The ability to send money by telegraph had existed since the 19th century. You could pay for a telegram at one office and have cash delivered with the message at the destination. Western Union expanded this into a major service, allowing people to wire money to distant locations, a business that continues today long after the telegram service has ended. Telegraph companies also attempted to develop new services using their infrastructure. They offered telex service, which was essentially telegraph using teleprinter machines that could send and receive typed messages automatically, creating a written record. Telex became popular for international business communication from the 1930s through the 1980s because it was more reliable than early international telephone service and provided documentation. But telex was still fundamentally telegraph technology, and it too would eventually be replaced by newer communication methods. The Second World War saw extensive use of telegraph, radio, and telephone for military communications. The war accelerated development of electronic communication technology, including early computers designed partly for cryptography and code breaking. The use of telecommunications in the war demonstrated the strategic importance of communication infrastructure and the vulnerability of communication to interception and disruption. It also trained hundreds of thousands of people in operating and maintaining communication equipment, creating expertise that would be valuable in the post-war expansion of telecommunications. After World War II, the telecommunications industry experienced rapid growth and consolidation. Telephone service expanded dramatically as more households were connected and long-distance service became more affordable and reliable. International telephone service improved with better submarine telephone cables and satellite communication technology developed in the 1960s. Telegraph traffic continued declining as telephone became the default choice for most communication needs. By the 1960s, telegram service in most developed countries had become a niche product, used primarily for formal notifications, condolences, and congratulations, where the formality and written record of a telegram was valued over the convenience of a telephone call. The distinctive yellow Western Union telegram, delivered by messenger, became associated with important life events, births, deaths, graduations, emergencies, but was no longer used for routine business communication or news transmission. The romance of the telegraph persisted even as the practical technology faded. Telegraph operators, particularly those who had worked in wireless telegraphy, were seen as skilled professionals from an earlier era. Learning Morse code remained a requirement for amateur radio operators and for military communicators, though its practical necessity was diminishing. The telegraph key and sounder became historical artifacts, symbols of the communication revolution that had preceded the telephone and radio revolutions. Western Union sent its final telegram on January 27, 2006, marking the official end of telegram service in the United States after 155 years. The announcement received media coverage as the end of an era, though by 2006, very few telegrams were being sent. The technology had long since been superseded by telephone, fax, email, and other communication methods. A few countries maintained telegram services for a few more years, but the telegram as a communication medium was essentially extinct by the early 21st century. Yet, while the telegram died, the telegraph's influence on telecommunications technology persisted. Many fundamental concepts in modern communication were pioneered in telegraphy. The idea of encoding information as electrical signals transmitted through a medium, whether copper wire, fiber optic cable, or electromagnetic waves, was established by the telegraph. The concept of switching and routing messages through networks was developed for telegraph systems. The notion of standardized protocols for communication between different systems emerged from the need to interconnect telegraph networks. The telegraph also established business models and regulatory frameworks that shaped later telecommunications. The telegraph companies were among the first large corporations to operate as regulated utilities, providing essential services under government oversight. The legal and regulatory principles developed for telegraph companies were later applied to telephone companies, radio broadcasters, and eventually internet service providers. The tension between competition and monopoly in communication services, between private enterprise and public utility, between innovation and standardization, all these issues emerged first in the telegraph era. The social patterns established by the telegraph also persisted and intensified with later technologies. The telegraph had created expectations of rapid communication and immediate responses. It had accelerated the pace of business and journalism. It had made distance less relevant to communication. These patterns continued and accelerated with the telephone, which made communication even faster and more convenient, and with radio and television, which made information available instantly to mass audiences. The parallels between the telegraph revolution of the 19th century and the Internet revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries are striking and instructive. Both technologies dramatically reduced the cost and increased the speed of long-distance communication. Both created new forms of social interaction and community. Both transformed business practices and created new industries. Both generated anxiety about information overload, privacy, and the pace of modern life. Both were viewed with skepticism before becoming essential infrastructure, and both permanently changed society in ways that made it impossible to return to previous patterns of communication and social organization. The Internet, like the telegraph before it, is fundamentally a network for transmitting information encoded as electrical signals. The underlying principle that information can be converted to electrical form, transmitted through a medium and converted back to usable form at the destination, is the same one the telegraph pioneered. The Internet uses far more sophisticated encoding, transmission, and decoding methods than the telegraph, and it handles vast amounts of information simultaneously, but the fundamental concept was established when Morse sent his first message through copper wire. The social experiences of the telegraph era echo in our Internet age in sometimes eerie ways. Victorian-era telegraph operators who developed friendships with operators in distant cities through wire conversations anticipated social media connecting people who have never met in person. The compression of language in telegrams to reduce costs anticipated the abbreviations and emoji of text messaging and Twitter. The anxiety about being always reachable via telegram anticipated our struggles with constant connectivity via smartphones. The debates about whether telegraph communication was degrading language and encouraging superficial thinking echo contemporary concerns about social media and Internet communication.
Even specific phenomena recur. The telegraph enabled rapid spread of financial information and contributed to market volatility. The Internet has done the same with even greater speed and impact. The telegraph created celebrity and spread fame more rapidly than previous media. The Internet has accelerated this to the point where individuals could become famous overnight. The telegraph raised concerns about privacy as operators read messages. The Internet has raised similar and more serious privacy concerns about who can access digital communications. The telegraph was used to coordinate both constructive and destructive activities. The Internet serves similar dual purposes. Perhaps the most important parallel is that both the telegraph and the Internet are general-purpose communication technologies that enable countless applications their inventors never imagined. Morse thought the telegraph would be useful primarily for commercial and government communication. He didn't foresee it revolutionizing journalism, transforming financial markets, changing warfare, enabling rapid disaster response, or creating new forms of social interaction. Similarly, the Internet's pioneers in the 1960s and 1970s were building a system for research communication and didn't foresee it becoming a global platform for commerce, entertainment, social networking, and political organization. Both technologies also demonstrate that the social impacts of communication revolution are as important as the technical achievements. The telegraph's most significant legacy isn't the specific technology of Morse code and wire communication. That's obsolete. Rather, it's the social transformation that instant long-distance communication enabled, the expectations it created, and the patterns it established. Similarly, the Internet's most lasting impact may not be its current specific technical implementations, but the changes it makes in how humans communicate, organize, work, and relate to each other. The telegraph also offers lessons about how societies adapt to transformative technologies. The adoption of the telegraph took decades and required building extensive infrastructure, training operators, establishing standards, creating business models, developing regulations, and allowing people to discover applications and integrate the technology into their lives. The process wasn't smooth. There were false starts, competing systems, business failures, regulatory disputes, and social resistance. But gradually, the telegraph moved from novelty to necessity, becoming infrastructure that was taken for granted. This gradual adoption process allowed society some time to adapt to the telegraph's impacts, though it still created disruptions and anxieties. The Internet revolution has occurred much more rapidly, with widespread adoption in many parts of the world happening within just 2 decades. This compressed time frame has given society less time to adapt, potentially explaining some of the dislocations and concerns we experience. The telegraph era suggests that eventually societies do adapt to communication revolutions, and that many anxieties about new technologies diminish as people become familiar with them and develop social norms for their use. The telegraph's obsolescence also offers perspective on technology change. A technology that seemed revolutionary and essential can become obsolete as newer technologies emerge that serve the same needs better. This doesn't diminish the original technology's historical importance, but it does remind us that no specific technology is permanent. The telegraph dominated long-distance communication for about a century before being superseded by technologies that did the same things more conveniently. Those technologies, telephone, fax, email, are themselves being supplemented or replaced by newer forms of communication. Yet the fundamental human need that the telegraph addressed, the desire to communicate across distance, to share information, to maintain connections despite physical separation, remains constant. Technologies change, but human needs persist. The telegraph was one solution to those needs, a brilliant and transformative solution for its time. The Internet is a more recent solution to the same fundamental needs, more powerful and more versatile than the telegraph, but serving ultimately similar purposes. The telegraph's legacy lives on in the modern world in ways both visible and invisible. The routes that telegraph cables once followed often became routes for telephone cables, and eventually fiber optic cables carrying Internet traffic. Cities that became telegraph hubs often remained telecommunications centers in the telephone and Internet eras because the infrastructure and expertise concentrated there. The regulatory frameworks developed for telegraphy influenced how later communication technologies were governed. More subtly, the telegraph established the expectation that distance should not be a barrier to communication, that information should move rapidly, that businesses and governments should be able to coordinate across vast territories, and that people have a right to know about distant events quickly. These expectations, once revolutionary, are now so fundamental to how we think about communication that we rarely notice them. We take for granted that we can communicate instantly with people on the other side of the world, that news from anywhere reaches everywhere within minutes, that distance is largely irrelevant to information flow.
The telegraph created these expectations, and they have persisted and intensified through all the communication technologies that followed. The human stories of the telegraph era leave a legacy. The operators who developed skills in Morse code and took pride in their craft remind us that technologies are operated by people whose expertise and dedication make the systems work. The inventors like Morse and Field, who persisted through repeated failures before achieving success, demonstrate that transformative innovations often require years of effort, substantial risk, and the willingness to continue despite skepticism. The workers who laid cables across oceans, climbed poles to string wires, and maintained systems in all weather remind us of the physical labor required to build and maintain communication infrastructure.
The telegraph era also demonstrated that communication technology can be both liberating and controlling, democratic and monopolistic, empowering and anxiety-inducing. The telegraph enabled new freedoms, the freedom to communicate across distance, to access information from afar, to coordinate activities in new ways. But it also enabled new forms of control and surveillance, concentrated power in the hands of those who controlled the infrastructure, and created new pressures and anxieties. These dualities persist with every communication technology, including the Internet. Looking at the modern world, we can see the telegraph's influence everywhere, even though the technology itself has vanished. Our global economy, which operates on the assumption that information and financial transactions can move anywhere instantly, was made possible first by the telegraph. Our news media, which report events globally as they happen, emerged from the telegraph-enabled news services of the 19th century. Our expectation of rapid response to messages, which has only intensified with email and texting, began when the telegraph made same-day replies possible. Our anxiety about being constantly connected and always available started when telegrams began arriving at all hours demanding attention. The phrase "the Victorian Internet," coined by author Tom Standage in his 1998 book of that title, captures the parallels between the telegraph network and the Internet. Both created global communication networks, both enabled rapid information sharing, both transformed business, journalism, and social interaction. Both generated utopian hopes about connecting humanity and dystopian fears about information overload and loss of privacy. Both moved from being luxury services to essential infrastructure. Both created new industries and disrupted existing ones. Yet there are also important differences. The Internet is far more democratic than the telegraph ever was. Almost anyone can send and receive Internet messages, while telegrams required paying operators and were expensive enough to limit use. The Internet is multimedia, handling text, images, audio, and video, while the telegraph handled only text, and even that in compressed form. The Internet is interactive and allows complex many-to-many communication, while the telegraph was primarily point-to-point. The Internet has decentralized much content creation, while telegraph content was controlled by businesses, governments, and news organizations. These differences mean we shouldn't take the parallels too far. The Internet is not simply a faster, better telegraph, but the parallels are instructive for understanding both the telegraph's historical significance and the Internet's contemporary impacts. Both represent fundamental shifts in how humans communicate and organize society, and studying the telegraph revolution can provide perspective on our own digital revolution. The environmental legacy of the telegraph is mixed. The telegraph required extensive mining of copper and extraction of natural rubber, gutta percha, for insulation, representing significant resource extraction. But compared to the environmental impact of modern telecommunications, which require rare earth elements, energy-intensive manufacturing, and creates electronic waste, the telegraph was relatively modest in its resource demands. The wooden telegraph poles eventually decayed or were removed, and many telegraph cables were eventually recovered for their copper content. The telegraph's environmental footprint has largely disappeared, unlike the persistent impacts of modern electronics. In education, the telegraph era provides valuable historical lessons. The story of the telegraph demonstrates how technology and society influence each other, how infrastructure enables new possibilities, how innovations diffuse through societies, and how transformative change occurs.
Teaching about the telegraph helps students understand that our current communication technologies are not inevitable or eternal, but are products of specific historical developments and will themselves eventually be superseded by newer innovations. The telegraph also appears in historical preservation and museums, where vintage telegraph equipment, restored telegraph offices, and demonstrations of Morse code operation help people understand 19th century communication. These preservation efforts serve both educational and commemorative purposes, honoring the achievement of the telegraph era and the people who made it work. The clicking of a telegraph sounder, unfamiliar to people who grew up with telephones and internet, provides a tangible connection to a different era of communication technology. Amateur radio operators and some military communication specialists still learn Morse code, though it's no longer required for most purposes. This continuation of telegraph-era skills is partly practical. Morse code remains useful for low-power, long-distance communication where voice transmission is difficult, and partly cultural, maintaining a connection to communication traditions and honoring the heritage of wireless telegraphy. The community of Morse code operators, though small, keeps alive skills and knowledge from the telegraph era. The telegraph's artistic and cultural legacy includes its appearance in literature, film, and art from the 19th century through the present. Telegraph operators appear as characters in numerous stories and films, often portrayed as connecting characters who are separated by distance, or as bearers of important news. The telegraph itself has become a symbol of 19th century modernity, of the Industrial Revolution, of the interconnected world emerging in that era. When contemporary artists or filmmakers want to evoke the Victorian era, they often include telegraph wires and operators as visual shorthand for the period's technology and communication. The language of the telegraph has left traces in modern communication. The word telegram itself, though the technology is obsolete, remains in our vocabulary. The phrase to telegraph, meaning to signal something in advance, comes from the technology. Morse code appears in popular culture, in films and television shows, as a form of coded communication. The abbreviations and compressed language of telegrams influenced later communication forms, from newspaper headlines to text messages.
As we reflect on the telegraph's legacy from our vantage point in the 21st century, certain insights emerge. First, the telegraph demonstrates that communication technology can have transformative impacts far beyond what inventors envision. Morse wanted to speed up communication. He created something that transformed how the world worked. Second, the telegraph shows that infrastructure matters. Building the physical network of wires and cables enabled applications and uses that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Third, the telegraph era reveals that social adaptation to new technology takes time and involves both enthusiasm and resistance, both utopian hopes and practical anxieties. Fourth, the telegraph's history shows that the most transformative technologies are often those that enable many different applications rather than serving a single purpose. The telegraph was used for business, journalism, government, personal communication, and countless other purposes, and this versatility was key to its impact. Fifth, the telegraph era demonstrates that communication technology can be both liberating and controlling, that it creates new freedoms and new constraints, new opportunities, and new problems. Finally, the telegraph's trajectory from revolutionary novelty to essential infrastructure to obsolete relic reminds us that no specific technology is permanent. What matters is not the particular technical implementation, but the human needs being addressed and the social changes enabled. The telegraph addressed humanity's need to communicate across distance and enabled a more interconnected world. Those needs and that interconnection persist and intensify even though we no longer send messages in Morse code through copper wires. The telegraph shrunk the world overnight, or at least over the course of several decades in the 19th century. It made distance less relevant to communication, enabled coordination across vast territories, accelerated commerce and journalism, transformed warfare and diplomacy, and created expectations of rapid communication that have only intensified. The world the telegraph created, instantaneously connected, information-rich, fast-paced, is the world we still inhabit, even though the specific technology has been replaced multiple times over.
In this sense, we are all heirs to the telegraph revolution. The expectation that we can communicate instantly across any distance, that information should be rapidly available, that distance is largely irrelevant to human connection, these expectations were created by the telegraph and persist in our internet age. The anxieties about information overload, about being constantly connected, about the acceleration of life's pace, these too began in the telegraph era and continue today. The telegraph didn't just change the 19th century, it permanently changed human expectations about communication and created a trajectory toward ever faster, ever more pervasive connectivity that continues today.
We have journeyed together through the extraordinary story of the telegraph, from the slow world of the 1830s, where messages traveled at the speed of horses, through the experimental years when inventors wrestled with electricity and wire, across the ocean floors where cables connected continents, into the bustling telegraph offices of the Victorian era, through the wars and crises where dots and dashes changed history, and finally to the telegraph's gradual decline and its enduring legacy in our connected world. It was a journey of just over a century and a half, from Morse's first message in 1844 to the final telegram in 2006. But in that time, the telegraph transformed human society as profoundly as perhaps any technology in history. It collapsed distance, accelerated commerce, revolutionized journalism, changed warfare, enabled modern corporations, created new forms of social connection, and established expectations about communication that persist today. The telegraph operators who clicked out messages in Morse code, the engineers who laid cables across oceans, the inventors who persisted through failure, the workers who strung wires and maintained systems, they built something extraordinary. They created the first global communication network, the first system that allowed instant transmission of information across continents and oceans. They shrank the world not physically but communicatively, making it possible for humans separated by thousands of miles to exchange ideas in minutes rather than months. The world they created is the world we inhabit. Yes, we use different technologies now, smartphones instead of telegraph keys, fiber optic cables instead of copper wire, wireless signals instead of submarine cables, but the fundamental change they initiated, the shift from slow to instant communication, from isolation to connection, from local to global awareness, that change is permanent. We can no more return to the slow world of the pre-telegraph era than we can uninvent electricity. The telegraph also teaches us lessons about our own digital revolution. It shows us that transformative communication technologies create both opportunities and anxieties, that societies need time to adapt to new communication capabilities, that infrastructure matters enormously, and that the social impacts of communication technology often exceed what inventors envision. As we grapple with the Internet's impacts on society, looking back at the telegraph era provides perspective and reminds us that humanity has navigated communication revolutions before. Perhaps most importantly, the telegraph reminds us that technology serves human needs and purposes. The telegraph was not important because of the elegant simplicity of Morse code or the engineering achievement of submarine cables, remarkable as those were. It was important because it addressed fundamental human needs to communicate, to share information, to maintain connections across distance, to coordinate activities, to understand the wider world. These needs persist regardless of the specific technologies we use to address them.
The telegraph is gone now, its wires mostly removed, its offices closed, its operators departed. The clicking of telegraph sounders, which once filled offices and railway stations, is silent except in museums and historical demonstrations. The yellow telegram, which once announced births and deaths, victories and disasters, is no longer delivered. The technology that revolutionized the 19th century has joined earlier innovations like the printing press and the steam engine in the history books. But the world the telegraph created endures. We still live in an instantly connected world where distance is largely irrelevant to communication. We still expect rapid responses to messages and immediate access to information. We still struggle with the pace of modern life and the pressure of constant connectivity. We still organize businesses, governments, and societies around the assumption that information can flow anywhere instantly. All these patterns were established in the telegraph era, and they have persisted and intensified through every communication technology that followed. The telegraph shrunk the world overnight, or more accurately, over several decades in the mid-19th century, but that shrinkage was permanent. The world has never expanded again to the size it was before the telegraph. Instead, it has continued shrinking as telephone, radio, television, and internet have made communication even faster, easier, and more pervasive. We now take for granted capabilities that would have seemed like magic to someone living in 1830, and much of that transformation began when Samuel Morse tapped out "What hath God wrought?" and sent the first message racing through a copper wire. As we close this journey through the telegraph's history, we should pause to appreciate the magnitude of what those 19th century inventors, engineers, operators, and workers accomplished. They built the first global communication network with technology that seems primitive by today's standards: copper wire, simple electromagnets, hand-operated keys, and a code of dots and dashes. Yet they succeeded in connecting the world, proving that distance need not be a barrier to communication, and establishing patterns and expectations that shape our lives today. The legacy of lightning lives on not in the specific technology of the telegraph, which is obsolete, but in the connected world it created, the expectations it established, and the trajectory toward ever greater connectivity it initiated. Every time we send an email, make a phone call, browse the internet, or text a friend, we are heirs to what the telegraph began, the transformation of human communication from slow and local to instant and global. The telegraph shrunk the world overnight. What we do with that connected world is up to us.